In the mists of ancient time, when gods walked among mortals and legends were forged in blood and bronze, there existed a rage that would birth champions. The screams of dying women echoed across the battlefields of prehistory, mothers, daughters, sisters fallen beneath the merciless wheels of conquest, their voices rising like smoke to the heavens, where divine eyes watched with growing fury. This was not merely war. This was the systematic erasure of the feminine divine, the brutal silencing of half of creation's song. The Olympian gods, those immortal architects of fate, witnessed this cosmic imbalance with mounting unease. In their marble halls high above Mount Olympus, where ambrosia flowed like golden rivers and time bent to divine will, a council convened that would reshape the mortal realm forever. Zeus, the thunder-bearer, his brow darkened with storms yet unborn, looked upon the slaughter with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. Aphrodite, her beauty terrible in its perfection, wept tears that became pearls of rage. But it was Athena, gray-eyed goddess of wisdom and warfare, who spoke the words that would echo through eternity. Enough. Let there be balance restored. The divine plan that emerged from those celestial deliberations was audacious beyond mortal comprehension. Not content with mere intervention in existing conflicts, the gods would create something entirely new, a society of women who would serve as living proof that feminine strength could match and surpass masculine brutality. These would be the Amazons, crafted not from mortal clay alone but infused with divine essence, blessed with longevity that bordered on immortality, and trained in arts of war that would make them the equal of any force on earth. The location chosen for this grand experiment was a hidden island, shrouded in mists that mortal eyes could not penetrate, protected by mystical barriers that would keep it safe from the corrupting influence of man's world. This was Themyscira Paradise Island, where purple shores met crystalline waters, where ancient trees whispered secrets in languages older than human speech, and where the very air hummed with magical potential. The island itself seemed to pulse with life, its geography shaped by divine hands to provide every necessity: fertile valleys for cultivation, crystal springs of healing waters, marble quarries for grand construction, and training grounds where the clash of bronze on bronze would ring out for millennia to come. But the creation of the Amazons themselves required a sacrifice that would forever define their character. The gods gathered the souls of women who had died unjustly, those murdered by men, those who had perished defending their children, those whose voices had been silenced by brutality and oppression. These souls, pure in their suffering and ennobled by their sacrifice, were given new form through divine craftsmanship. Each Amazon was shaped with purpose, her body a vessel for both extraordinary beauty and devastating power, her mind sharp enough to grasp both strategy and philosophy, her heart large enough to contain both fierce love and righteous fury. Hippolyta emerged from this divine forging as something unprecedented, not merely the first among equals, but a queen whose very existence embodied the Amazon ideal. Tall and commanding, with hair like spun gold and eyes that held the depth of ocean storms, she possessed wisdom that came not from years alone, but from divine blessing. The gods had crafted her to be both warrior and ruler, diplomat and philosopher, the living embodiment of what women could achieve when freed from the constraints of male-dominated society. Upon her brow, they placed a golden diadem that would mark her as Queen Eternal, and in her hands, they placed the responsibility for guiding her sisters toward their destiny. The early years of Themyscira were not without challenge. These newly born Amazons, despite their divine origins, had to learn to live together, to forge bonds of sisterhood from the ashes of their previous suffering. They came from different eras, different cultures, speaking different tongues. A Egyptian priestess might find herself training alongside a Celtic warrior, a Mesopotamian scholar debating philosophy with a Minoan craftswoman. Yet gradually, under Hippolyta's patient guidance and the gods' continued blessing, they began to coalesce into something remarkable, a society where strength was celebrated but not worshipped, where wisdom was valued above conquest, where the arts of both war and peace flourished in equal measure. The Amazon training regimens became legendary even among the gods themselves. At dawn, when the first rays of Helios painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, The Amazons would gather in the great amphitheater for morning exercises that would have crippled mortal warriors. They moved through combat forms that blended deadly efficiency with dancer's grace, their bronze armor catching the light as they wheeled and struck in perfect synchronization. Archery practice followed, with contests where arrows could split hairs at distances that would challenge even the huntress Artemis. Swordplay came next, not the brutal hacking of battlefield butchers, but elegant bladework that elevated combat to art form, where each strike was precise, each parry a calculated response to anticipated attack. But the Amazons were far more than mere warriors. The gods had blessed them with intellectual gifts that rivaled their physical prowess. In the great libraries of Themyscira, scrolls contained wisdom gathered from across the known world, mathematical theorems that wouldn't be rediscovered by mortal minds for centuries. Philosophical treatises that grappled with questions of justice and virtue. Scientific observations that revealed the hidden workings of the natural world. Amazon scholars debated ethics with the same passion their sisters brought to combat training, their discussions ranging from practical questions of governance to abstract explorations of the nature of divinity itself. The island's architecture reflected this balance between martial and intellectual pursuits. The palace of Hippolyta rose like a magnificent marble hymn to both beauty and strength, its columns carved with reliefs depicting Amazon achievements in both war and peace. Training grounds sprawled across manicured terraces, their surfaces polished smooth by countless hours of practice, while nearby gardens burst with exotic flowers, whose very existence defied natural law, blooms that sang with the voices of nightingales, trees that bore fruit capable of healing grievous wounds, vines that glowed with soft phosphorescence when touched by Amazon hands. Yet, for all their achievements, the Amazons remained haunted by prophecy. The oracle of Themyscira, blessed with sight beyond mortal ken, spoke often of a child yet to be born who would bridge the gap between their paradise and the world beyond their shores. This champion would carry Amazon ideals into man's world, serving as both warrior and ambassador, proving that the lessons learned in Themyscira could transform even the most corrupt societies. The prophecy spoke of great trials ahead of gods who would test this chosen one, of enemies who would rise to challenge everything the Amazons held sacred, of a destiny that would reshape not merely one world, but the very nature of heroism itself. As centuries passed and became millennia, Themyscira evolved into something that exceeded even divine expectations. It became not merely a society of warrior women, but a living demonstration of what civilization could achieve when built upon principles of justice, compassion, and strength tempered by wisdom. The Amazons developed art forms that made mortal masterpieces seem crude by comparison. Sculptures that seemed to breathe with life, paintings that captured not merely appearance but the very essence of their subjects, music that could move listeners to tears or inspire them to impossible courage. Their system of governance, too, became a model of enlightened rule. Though Hippolyta reigned as queen, her authority was balanced by a council of sisters whose voices carried equal weight in matters of policy. Decisions were reached through debate and consensus rather than royal decree, with every Amazon's opinion valued regardless of her age or station. Justice was administered with careful attention to both letter and spirit of their laws, with mercy balanced against the need for order, forgiveness weighed against the requirements of protection. The gods themselves took notice of what they had wrought, visiting Themyscira regularly to observe the progress of their grand experiment. Zeus would arrive in thunderous pageantry, his presence filling the very air with electric potential, to witness combat displays that showcased Amazon martial prowess. Athena came more quietly, appearing in the libraries to engage in philosophical discourse with Amazon scholars, her owl-bright eyes gleaming with approval at their insights. Aphrodite blessed their artistic endeavors, inspiring creations of such beauty that even immortal eyes were moved to wonder. Artemis ran with them through forest trails, her silver bow singing alongside Amazon arrows in competitions that lasted from dawn to dusk. But perhaps most significantly, the gods began to understand that they had created something that transcended their original intentions. The Amazons were not merely weapons to be wielded against the injustices of man's world, but a new form of life that possessed its own destiny, its own dreams, its own sacred mission. They had become the keepers of ancient wisdom and the guardians of future hope, the living bridge between divine ideal and mortal possibility. As the shadow of prophesied destiny grew longer across their paradise, as signs and portents multiplied in both heaven and earth, the Amazons prepared for whatever trials lay ahead. They had been forged in divine fire and tempered by centuries of purpose. Their champion, when she came, would be ready for whatever destiny awaited, not merely because of her individual strength, but because she would carry within her the accumulated wisdom, courage, and love of a civilization that had dared to dream of justice made manifest. The stage was set. The players were in position, and in the swirling mists that surrounded their island paradise, the winds of fate began to whisper of a birth that would change everything. The night Diana was born, the very heavens seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Above Themyscira, stars wheeled in patterns that had not been seen since the first days of creation, their light painting the purple shores in ethereal silver. The sacred groves whispered with voices that spoke in tongues older than memory, while the crystal springs bubbled with waters that glowed like liquid moonbeams. Even the immortal Amazons, who had witnessed countless miracles in their ageless existence, felt the weight of destiny settling upon their island like a mantle woven from dreams and prophecy. In the deepest chambers of the palace, where ancient magic thrummed through marble walls like a living heartbeat, Queen Hippolyta knelt before an altar that had been prepared according to instructions received in divine visions. The altar itself was a masterwork of Amazon craftsmanship carved from a single block of white marble that seemed to glow with inner light, its surface inscribed with symbols that predated written language. Upon it lay clay of extraordinary providence, not the common earth of mortal realms, but sacred clay gathered from the shores of Paradise Island itself, clay that had been blessed by each of the Olympian gods and infused with the essence of creation itself. For months, Hippolyta had labored over this project with the devotion of both artist and mother. Her hands, skilled in wielding sword and scepter with equal grace, moved now with infinite tenderness as she shaped the clay into human form. Every curve and line was crafted with divine inspiration, each detail emerging as if guided by unseen hands. The figure that gradually took shape was beautiful, beyond mortal comprehension, a child whose very form seemed to embody the Amazon ideal of feminine perfection, strength, and grace, combined in harmonious unity. But this was no mere sculpture, no static representation of artistic vision. As Hippolyta worked, pouring not just skill but the very essence of her love into the clay, she whispered prayers to the gods who had promised to bless this endeavor. She spoke of her hopes for this child, that she would embody the best of Amazon virtue, that she would serve as bridge between worlds, that she would carry the banner of justice into realms that had forgotten the meaning of the word. With each whispered word, the clay seemed to grow warmer beneath her touch, as if responding to the love that infused every moment of its creation. The moment of divine intervention came as the first rays of dawn broke across the island's eastern shores. The air in the chamber began to shimmer with otherworldly power, and one by one, the Olympian gods materialized in forms that could be perceived by mortal senses. Zeus appeared first, his presence filling the room with the scent of ozone and the distant rumble of thunder. The king of gods looked upon Hippolyta's work with eyes that had witnessed the birth of stars, and his approval was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Athena followed, her gray eyes bright with wisdom and purpose, carrying in her hands a vial of what appeared to be liquid starlight. "I give to this child the gift of wisdom," she intoned, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority, "that she may see truth even when it is hidden, that she may choose justice even when it is difficult, that she may lead others toward enlightenment through both word and deed." The liquid starlight poured forth like blessed water, sinking into the clay figure and causing it to glow with soft, pearl-like radiance. Aphrodite stepped forward next, her beauty so perfect that it seemed to make the very air around her sing with harmony. "I grant the gifts of love and compassion," she declared, touching the clay figure's chest above where a heart would beat. "May she love fiercely and be loved in return. May she see the beauty in all creation. May her heart be large enough to embrace both friend and enemy with equal grace." Where her fingers touched, the clay seemed to take on the warm flush of living flesh. Artemis, silver bow gleaming in the divine light, spoke with the voice of wilderness winds. I bestow the gifts of speed and agility, that she may run with the deer and soar with the eagles, that no earthly pursuer may catch her when justice calls her to flight, that her movements in battle may be as fluid as water and as swift as lightning. The clay figure's limbs seemed to gain definition and strength, muscles forming beneath the surface as if preparing for action. Demeter, her robes rustling like wheat in summer breezes, added her blessing. I give the gift of strength, drawn from the earth itself, that she may stand firm against any foe, that her power may be as enduring as mountain stone and as nurturing as fertile soil, that she may protect the innocent with hands that can both comfort and defend. The figure's frame seemed to expand slightly, taking on the robust health of one blessed by the harvest goddess. Hestia, keeper of the sacred flame, spoke last among the goddesses. I grant the gift of truth, that she may see through deception as fire burns through darkness, that her words may carry the power of honesty, that she may serve as beacon of integrity in a world too often shrouded in lies. A warm glow suffused the entire figure, as if a gentle flame had been kindled within its core. Finally, Zeus himself stepped forward, and when he spoke, his words carried the authority of cosmic law. I breathe into this clay the spark of life itself, that she may walk among mortals as champion of justice, that she may serve as bridge between divine and human realms, that her destiny may be written not in the stars alone, but in the choices she makes with her own free will. The thunder-bearer leaned down and breathed upon the clay figure, and in that moment, the impossible became manifest. The transformation was both gradual and instantaneous, a paradox that only divine magic could achieve. The clay began to shift and warm, taking on the texture and color of living flesh. Lungs expanded with first breath. A heart began to beat with rhythm as steady as ocean waves. Eyes fluttered open to reveal irises of startling blue that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond what any newborn should possess. The child for child, she was perfect and beautiful and utterly alive, drew in her first breath and released it in a sound that was part sigh, part song, and entirely magical. Hippolyta, tears of joy streaming down her face, gathered this miracle child into her arms with reverence and overwhelming love. Diana, she whispered, speaking the name that had come to her in dreams. My daughter, my heart, my greatest treasure. The child looked up at her with those impossibly wise eyes and smiled, not the reflexive expression of an infant, but the knowing smile of one who understood, even in that first moment, the magnitude of the love that surrounded her. But even as the gods celebrated this successful culmination of their divine plan, shadows of complexity began to emerge. For there existed another version of this birth story, one whispered in later years when ancient secrets could no longer be contained. In this alternative telling, Diana was not merely clay given life, but something far more complicated. The daughter of Zeus himself, conceived through divine union with Hippolyta, her true parentage hidden to protect both mother and child from the jealous wrath of Hera. This version spoke of clandestine meetings between the Amazon queen and the king of gods, of a love that transcended the usual divine dalliances of a child born to bridge, not merely human and Amazon worlds, but mortal and divine realms as well. In this telling, Diana's extraordinary abilities stemmed not from divine blessing alone, but from divine heritage, making her not just Amazon princess, but Olympian royalty, heir to powers that could reshape reality itself. Regardless of which origin held the greater truth, and perhaps both contained elements of reality that mortal minds could not fully comprehend, the child who emerged from that sacred night was clearly destined for greatness. Diana's first years on Themyscira unfolded like a song of joy and wonder. She grew with supernatural swiftness, her development following divine rather than mortal patterns, each day bringing new revelations of her extraordinary nature. As a toddler, she displayed strength that could shatter marble with careless gestures, speed that allowed her to outrun Amazon messengers, and a preternatural understanding of languages both spoken and written. Amazon scholars marveled as the child, barely old enough to form coherent sentences, engaged them in philosophical discussions that demonstrated wisdom far beyond her apparent years. She could speak with animals in their own tongues, convincing eagles to carry messages and persuading dolphins to race her through Themyscira's coastal waters. Her education began almost from the moment she could walk, for the Amazons understood that such gifts required careful cultivation. Philippus, the captain of the Amazon Guard, took personal responsibility for Diana's martial training, crafting scaled-down weapons that could withstand the child's gradually increasing strength. Even in those early lessons, Diana displayed an intuitive understanding of combat that amazed her instructors. She moved as if following choreography written in her very bones, her strikes precise, her defensive positions flawless. But it was Diana's heart that truly set her apart. Unlike the gods, whose emotions often ran to extremes of passion and rage, or the Amazons, whose long years had sometimes cooled into detached wisdom, Diana possessed a capacity for love and compassion that seemed limitless. She wept when she saw suffering, even in the smallest creatures, and rushed to provide comfort wherever she found need. Amazon historians would later write that no child in their long history had shown such natural empathy, such instinctive understanding of others' pain and joy. As Diana grew from child to adolescent, her curiosity about the world beyond Themyscira's shores intensified. She would stand for hours on the cliffs overlooking the sea, staring into the mists that hid their island from mortal view, asking endless questions about the realm her mother called man's world. What were these humans like? Why did the Amazons speak of them with such mixture of concern and contempt? What would it be like to walk among beings who were not blessed with immortal life and divine purpose? Hippolyta, watching her daughter's growing fascination with the forbidden world beyond their paradise, felt the first stirrings of prophetic dread. She remembered the oracle's words spoken on the night of Diana's birth. This child will bridge two worlds, but the crossing will cost her dearly. She will face trials that would break lesser spirits, know losses that would crush mortal hearts, and make choices that will reshape the very nature of heroism. The queen found herself torn between motherly protectiveness and divine duty. Part of her wanted to keep Diana safe within Themyscira's mystical barriers forever, to let her daughter grow and flourish without ever knowing the pain and corruption that infected the outside world. But another part recognized that such protection would ultimately deny Diana her true destiny, would rob both her and the world of the champion they were meant to become together. As Diana's training intensified and her abilities continued to develop, signs began to appear that her time of testing was drawing near. The gods visited more frequently, observing her progress with expressions that mixed pride and apprehension. The oracle's visions grew more frequent and more specific, speaking of a man falling from the sky who would bring news of a world in crisis, of a contest that would determine who among the Amazons would venture forth as champion, of trials and tribulations that would test every aspect of Diana's character. The young Amazon princess, now growing into the full flower of her divine heritage, felt these portents like storm winds on the horizon. In her dreams, she saw flashes of a world beyond cities of glass and steel, conflicts that raged not with sword and spear, but with weapons of unimaginable destruction, suffering on a scale that dwarfed even the ancient injustices that had given birth to the Amazons themselves. And always, threading through these visions like a golden cord of destiny, came the certainty that she was meant to be part of whatever solution lay ahead. The stage was being set for the next act in Diana's story, for the moment when paradise would be shattered by intrusion from the outside world, when the carefully maintained isolation of Themyscira would be broken forever. But for now, in these last peaceful days before destiny called, Diana continued to grow in wisdom and strength, preparing for trials she could not yet imagine, becoming the champion her world would need. The gods had shaped her, the Amazons had trained her, love had nurtured her. Soon, destiny would claim her. The serenity of Paradise Island shattered like crystals struck by lightning on the morning Steve Trevor fell from the sky. It began as the faintest disturbance on the horizon, a silver speck against the azure dome of heaven that grew larger with each passing heartbeat, trailing smoke and flame like a fallen star. The mystical barriers that had protected Themyscira for millennia, invisible walls of divine power that turned away mortal eyes and deflected the instruments of man's world, suddenly flickered and wavered, as if struck by forces they were never designed to withstand. High above, in her palace chambers, Queen Hippolyta felt the island's protective enchantments tremble through her very bones. The golden diadem upon her brow, attuned to every mystical ward and barrier surrounding their paradise, grew warm against her skin as ancient magics strained against intrusion. She rushed to her balcony, where the sight that greeted her filled her immortal heart with prophetic dread. A mortal aircraft, clearly of human origin, spinning helplessly through their sacred airspace, its pilot fighting desperately to maintain control of a machine that was never meant to penetrate divine sanctuary. The crash, when it came, was both violent and strangely gentle, as if the island itself cushioned the impact to preserve the life of the unexpected visitor. The aircraft, a sleek military fighter bearing markings that spoke of distant conflicts, carved a furrow through the purple sand of Themyscira's eastern shore before coming to rest in a tangle of twisted metal and scattered debris. Steam rose from its broken engine like incense offered to uncaring gods, while waves lapped gently at the wreckage, as if the sea itself sought to soothe the violence of this unprecedented intrusion. Diana, who had been practicing her swordwork in the palace courtyard when the barriers failed, felt the shock of the crash through every fiber of her being. The mystical connection she shared with Themyscira, a bond deeper than blood, stronger than steel, carried to her the island's distress like a physical blow. Without conscious thought, she began running toward the crash site, her feet barely touching the marble steps as she descended from palace to shore with superhuman speed, her heart pounding not with exertion but with a mixture of excitement and foreboding that she could not name. She reached the wreckage ahead of the Amazon guard, her divine heritage granting her speed that surpassed even her immortal sisters. The sight that greeted her there would be burned into her memory for all eternity. A man, clearly mortal, despite the strange garments he wore, slumped unconscious in the twisted remains of his craft. Blood seeped from wounds across his forehead, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that spoke of serious injury. Yet there was something about him that commanded immediate attention. This was no mere wanderer who had stumbled upon their shore. This was someone whose arrival had been significant enough to breach barriers that had held firm for thousands of years. Diana knelt beside the unconscious pilot, her training in Amazon healing arts warring with childhood warnings about the corruption of men. Yet as she looked upon this stranger's face, strong-jawed and honest, even in unconsciousness, marked by lines that spoke of both courage and compassion, she felt no trace of the evil or weakness that Amazon lore attributed to the male gender. Instead, she sensed something that resonated with her own deepest convictions, a dedication to justice, a willingness to sacrifice for others, a spirit that burned with the same desire to protect the innocent that drove her own actions. When she reached out to assess his injuries, her fingers barely brushing his skin, Steve Trevor's eyes fluttered open, gray eyes that held depths of experience and determination that Diana found immediately compelling. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stared at each other across the vast gulf that separated their worlds. He saw a figure that might have stepped from the pages of mythology itself, a young woman of impossible beauty, whose very presence seemed to radiate divine power, clad in simple training clothes that could not disguise her otherworldly nature. She saw a man whose arrival had already begun to change everything, whose very existence challenged assumptions that had shaped Amazon thought for millennia. "Angel," Steve whispered, his voice hoarse from smoke and trauma. "Are you an angel?" The words, spoken in a language Diana had learned from ancient texts but never heard from living lips, carried such pure wonder that her heart clenched with unexpected emotion. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the Amazon guard, led by Philippus and accompanied by a dozen of Themyscira's finest warriors, their bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun, their faces stern with the gravity of this unprecedented situation. What followed was debate that raged for hours in the great council chamber of the palace. The Amazons, despite their centuries of wisdom and divine guidance, found themselves confronted with a situation for which no precedent existed. Never in their long history had a man set foot upon Themyscira's sacred shores. The mystical barriers that protected their paradise had been specifically designed to prevent such intrusion. Yet here stood living proof that even divine protection could be overcome by circumstances beyond mortal comprehension. Some among the council argued for immediate action. The stranger should be healed and returned to his world as quickly as possible, before his presence could contaminate their paradise or alert his people to Themyscira's existence. Others contended that his arrival itself was a sign from the gods, a cosmic event that demanded careful consideration and measured response. Still others, voices of ancient caution, suggested that this might be some form of test or trap, that the pilot's seeming helplessness could mask sinister intent designed to breach their defenses from within. Through it all, Diana found herself arguing for compassion and understanding, with a passion that surprised even her own supporters. She spoke eloquently of Amazon principles, their dedication to justice, their protection of the innocent, their responsibility to aid those in need regardless of personal convenience. More privately, though she dared not voice such thoughts in open council, she felt drawn to this stranger in ways that she could not fully understand. His arrival had awakened something within her, a restless energy that demanded action beyond the comfortable routines of paradise. As the debate continued, Steve Trevor himself gradually recovered enough to participate in his own fate. The Amazon healing arts, supplemented by waters from Themyscira's sacred springs, proved more than adequate to mend his physical injuries, though the psychological impact of finding himself in what appeared to be a realm from ancient legend required considerably more time to process. When he finally stood before the assembled Amazon Council, speaking haltingly in ancient Greek that he had learned from archaeological texts, his words carried the weight of desperate truth. He told them of a world at war, not the clean, honorable conflicts of Amazon training exercises, but brutal mechanized warfare that consumed entire nations and threatened to spread its poison across the globe. He spoke of weapons that could level cities, of armies that numbered in the millions, of innocents caught in the crossfire of conflicts they neither understood nor desired. Most chilling of all, he described the rise of what he called a new kind of evil, organized, systematic, industrial, in its approach to human suffering, determined to reshape the world according to principles that would have horrified even the most depraved tyrants of antiquity. The name he spoke, Ares, sent shockwaves through the Amazon Council like earthquake tremors. For this was no mere mortal conflict that Steve described, but the latest manifestation of their oldest enemy's influence. The war god, whom they had thought contained if not defeated, was clearly active in man's world once again, stirring up conflicts and feeding on human suffering with an appetite that had grown enormous over the centuries of his apparent absence from divine affairs. Queen Hippolyta, listening to Steve's testimony with growing alarm, felt the weight of ancient prophecy settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of lead. The oracle's words, spoken over Diana's cradle decades earlier, rang in her memory with terrible clarity. The child born of clay and love will bridge two worlds when the greatest darkness threatens to consume all light. Her choice will determine not merely the fate of nations, but the very nature of heroism itself. The decision, when it came, emerged not from debate but from divine intervention. As sunset painted the palace chambers in shades of gold and crimson, the air began to shimmer with otherworldly presence. One by one, the Olympian gods materialized in forms that mortal eyes could perceive: Zeus with his aura of barely contained power, Athena radiating wisdom and purpose, Aphrodite glowing with love's transformative energy. Their message was clear and unambiguous. This was the moment spoken of in prophecy, the crisis that would require Amazon intervention, the test that would determine whether their millennia of preparation had been sufficient. "Choose a champion," Zeus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of cosmic law. "One who will venture into man's world as our representative, who will stand against the darkness that threatens to consume all creation, who will prove that the Amazon way can triumph even in the most corrupted of realms." Hippolyta, her heart already heavy with the knowledge of what must come, announced the contest that would determine Themyscira's champion. According to ancient law and sacred tradition, any Amazon who felt called to such service could participate in a series of trials designed to test every aspect of warrior skill and moral character. The contest would be comprehensive: archery to demonstrate precision and patience, swordplay to prove combat mastery, racing to show speed and endurance, wrestling to exhibit strength and tactical thinking, and philosophical challenge to reveal wisdom and commitment to justice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of Amazons stepped forward to volunteer, each bringing unique strengths and qualifications to the competition. Artemis, the red-headed warrior whose skills with spear and sword were legendary even among immortals, declared her readiness to face any challenge. Philippus, captain of the guard whose tactical brilliance had never been surpassed, offered her centuries of experience in the service of justice. Others followed: warriors, scholars, healers, crafters, each convinced that her particular gifts made her the ideal choice for this unprecedented mission. Diana watched the volunteers assemble with growing frustration and determination. She knew, with certainty that bypassed rational thought, that this was her destiny, that every moment of her life had been preparation for this crisis, that her unique combination of divine heritage and Amazon training made her the perfect champion for this task. Yet she also knew that her mother would never willingly allow her to participate in a contest that would almost certainly result in her departure from Themyscira forever. The solution, when it came to her, was both elegant and risky. If tradition demanded that all volunteers be allowed to compete, then she would volunteer but in disguise, hidden behind mask and altered costume, competing under an assumed identity until victory was assured. The deception felt wrong on multiple levels, violating both her nature and her relationship with her mother, yet the alternative, allowing another to take on what she knew to be her own cosmic responsibility, felt even more unacceptable. The contest itself unfolded over 3 days that seemed to compress all of Amazon history into their span. The great amphitheater, carved from living rock and blessed by divine hands, echoed with the clash of weapons and the roar of spectators, as Themyscira's finest warriors competed for the right to serve as their people's representative. Each trial revealed new depths of skill and character among the participants, yet from the beginning, one contestant, a mysterious figure competing under the name Diana Prince, began to distinguish herself through performances that bordered on the miraculous. In the archery trials, while other competitors achieved the precision expected of Amazon training, the mysterious warrior split arrow after arrow down to the very feather, her shots so accurate that they seemed guided by divine will rather than mere skill. During the swordplay competition, she moved with fluid grace that made veteran warriors appear clumsy by comparison, her blade work demonstrating not just technical mastery, but an almost supernatural understanding of combat flow and rhythm. The racing trials proved even more decisive. As the competitors thundered around the great track that circled the amphitheater, the disguised Diana gradually pulled ahead with speed that defied explanation. She ran as if the very wind carried her forward, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground, her breathing steady and controlled, even as she left her closest competitors far behind. Spectators began to whisper among themselves, who was this unknown warrior whose abilities seemed to surpass even the greatest champions of their immortal society? But it was during the wrestling competition that Diana's true nature began to shine through her disguise. Facing opponents whose strength had been legendary for centuries, she displayed not just physical superiority but a compassionate restraint that preserved her sister's dignity even in defeat. She won each match decisively yet gently, demonstrating her power while ensuring that none of her fellow Amazons suffered injury or humiliation. This combination of overwhelming ability and gracious conduct began to win over spectators who had initially been suspicious of the unknown competitor. The final trial, the test of wisdom and moral character, took place before the assembled gods themselves, with each finalist required to answer questions that probed the very depths of their understanding of justice, mercy, and heroic responsibility. When Diana's turn came, speaking still from behind her mask, her responses carried such profound insight and moral clarity that even Zeus nodded in approval. She spoke of justice not as vengeance but as healing, of strength not as dominance but as service, of victory not as conquest but as transformation. When the contest reached its climax, and the mysterious champion stood, revealed as the unanimous victor in every trial, Queen Hippolyta demanded that the winner remove her mask and reveal her identity. The moment of unmasking, when Diana's golden hair spilled free and her beloved face was revealed to the shocked assembly, marked the end of one chapter in Amazon history and the beginning of another. Hippolyta's reaction was everything Diana had feared and more. The Amazon queen's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and heartbreak in the span of moments, her immortal composure cracking like marble struck by divine lightning. "My daughter," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a mother's love and a ruler's responsibility. "What have you done?" But even as maternal anguish threatened to overwhelm royal duty, the gods themselves intervened to settle the matter. Zeus, his voice carrying the finality of cosmic law, declared that the contest had been fairly won and that divine will had clearly guided its outcome. Diana, victor in every trial and proven worthy by both deed and character, would serve as Themyscira's champion. No amount of motherly love could alter the judgment of destiny itself. The ceremony that followed, the ritual gifting of the sacred armaments that would transform Amazon Princess into Wonder Woman, carried solemnity that bordered on the funereal. Each item presented to Diana had been crafted not merely by Amazon artisans but blessed by the gods themselves, imbued with powers that would serve her in the trials ahead. The lasso of truth, woven from the golden girdle of Gaia herself, pulsed with divine energy that could compel honesty from even the most deceptive hearts. As Athena placed it in Diana's hands, the goddess spoke words of both blessing and warning. "This rope will reveal truth in all its forms, beautiful and terrible, simple and complex. Use it wisely, for truth can be a weapon more devastating than any sword." The bracelets of submission, forged from the chains that had once bound the Amazons in their darkest hour, gleamed with silver light that seemed to repel darkness itself. Fashioned from fragments of Zeus's aegis, they would turn aside any weapon, deflect any attack, serve as ultimate defense against those who would do harm to the innocent. As they closed around Diana's wrists, she felt their weight, not physical, but spiritual, a reminder of the responsibility she now carried. The golden armor, crafted in the forges of Hephaestus himself, molded itself to Diana's form as if it had been made specifically for her. The eagle emblazoned across the breastplate seemed to spread its wings with each breath she took, while the star-spangled skirt shimmered with light that spoke of banner and battle standard combined. This was not mere protection, but symbol-visible proof of Amazon ideals made manifest in the world of mortals. Finally came the tiara, the circlet of office that marked Diana not merely as champion, but as ambassador, diplomat, as well as warrior. As it settled upon her brow, she felt the weight of her people's hopes and fears, their dreams and desperate prayers for a world that might finally learn the lessons Themyscira had spent millennia perfecting. The farewell feast that followed was a celebration shadowed by sorrow, joy tempered by the knowledge that this parting might well be permanent. Amazon sisters who had trained beside Diana since childhood now looked upon her with mixture of pride and loss, understanding that the young woman they had known was already transforming into something larger, a living symbol that would represent their people in a world that had forgotten their very existence. As dawn approached, bringing with it the moment of departure, Diana stood once more upon the shores where Steve Trevor's aircraft had crashed, forever altering the course of her destiny. The wreckage had been cleared away, but the purple sand still bore marks of impact that seemed to glow with prophetic significance. Soon, she would leave this place, the only home she had ever known, the paradise that had shaped her understanding of justice and mercy and strength. Her last private conversation with Hippolyta, conducted in the pre-dawn darkness, while stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed designed by divine hands, carried all the weight of love and loss that mortal hearts were never meant to bear. "Come back to me," the Amazon queen whispered, holding her daughter close. "Whatever else happens in that world of men, promise me you will come back." Diana's response, spoken with certainty that surprised even herself, would echo through the ages. "I will return, mother, but not unchanged. None of us will be unchanged by what comes next." The invisible jet, another gift of divine technology that blended Amazon mysticism with capabilities beyond mortal understanding, waited in the harbor like a silver dream, made manifest. As Diana took her place at its controls, with Steve Trevor beside her still marveling at the impossibilities he had witnessed, she felt the first stirrings of the destiny that would reshape not merely her own life, but the very nature of heroism itself. Behind her, Themyscira began to fade into the morning mists, its mystical barriers reasserting themselves to hide paradise from mortal eyes once more. Ahead lay a world at war, a civilization tearing itself apart with conflicts that would test every principle she had learned, every ideal she held sacred. Between past and future, between paradise and chaos, Diana Prince prepared to become Wonder Woman. The contest was over. The champion had been chosen. The real test was about to begin. The transition from Paradise Island to the realm of mortals was more jarring than any physical blow Diana had ever endured. As the invisible jet pierced the mystical barriers that had protected Themyscira for millennia, she felt the very air around her change becoming heavier, more oppressive, tainted with scents and energies that spoke of industry, conflict, and human suffering on a scale that no Amazon teaching had adequately prepared her to comprehend. Where the atmosphere of her island home had hummed with divine harmony and natural balance, this new world assaulted her enhanced senses with a cacophony of mechanical noise, chemical pollution, and emotional turbulence that threatened to overwhelm even her superhuman constitution. Steve Trevor, still recovering from both his injuries and the impossible revelations of the past few days, served as her guide into this alien landscape of concrete and steel. As they flew over the Atlantic Ocean toward the embattled shores of Europe, he attempted to explain the complexities of the conflict that had consumed his world, a war unlike any in human history, fought with weapons of unprecedented destructive power, driven by ideologies that seemed to have sprung from the darkest corners of human imagination. It's not like the clean battles you must have studied in your ancient histories, Steve explained, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who had seen too much horror for his years. This isn't about honor or glory or even territory, not really. It's about power. The power to reshape entire continents, according to one man's vision. The power to decide who lives and who dies, based on accidents of birth. The power to turn science itself into an instrument of mass destruction. Diana listened to his words with growing alarm, her Amazon-trained mind struggling to comprehend conflicts that violated every principle of just warfare her people had ever conceived. Where Amazon combat was personal and honorable, limited in scope and guided by strict codes of conduct, this human war seemed designed to cause maximum suffering with minimum personal risk. Weapons that could kill from vast distances, poisons that could contaminate entire regions, strategies that deliberately targeted civilian populations. All of this represented a corruption of the warrior's art that struck her as almost blasphemous. Their first view of London, as the invisible jet descended through clouds heavy with smoke and rain, provided visual confirmation of Steve's descriptions. The great city stretched below them like a wounded giant, its ancient architecture scarred by bomb craters and fires, its streets filled with people who moved with the hunched, hurried gait of those who had learned to live under constant threat. Even from the air, Diana could see evidence of the struggle. Barrage balloons floating like deadly jellyfish above important buildings, searchlights sweeping the skies in nervous patterns, the geometric scars where entire blocks had been reduced to rubble by aerial bombardment. The landing, executed in a secluded area of Hyde Park under cover of darkness, brought Diana her first direct contact with the soil of man's world. The moment her feet touched English earth, she felt a shock of recognition that bypassed rational thought. This land, too, was sacred, blessed with the same divine spark that animated all creation, yet somehow wounded, its natural harmony disrupted by centuries of conflict and exploitation. She could sense the ghosts of ancient forests that had once covered these fields, the spirits of rivers that had been channeled and poisoned, the memory of times when humans had lived in better balance with the natural world. Steve's colleagues, waiting nervously in the shadows with the mixture of skepticism and desperate hope that marked all intelligence operations during wartime, reacted to Diana's appearance with predictable amazement. Here was a woman who moved with impossible grace, whose very presence seemed to radiate authority and power, whose costume and bearing marked her as something beyond their experience or understanding. Yet their need for any advantage in the desperate struggle against fascism overcame their natural incredulity, and they listened with growing excitement as Steve outlined the assistance this mysterious ally might provide. Diana's first impression of these men, Colonel Phillips, with his gruff military bearing, Samir with his theatrical background and quick wit, Charlie with his haunted eyes and steady hands, Chief, with his quiet wisdom and deep understanding of human nature, was complex and contradictory. They were clearly products of a world very different from her own, shaped by experiences that had taught them to view life through lenses of pragmatism and survival that sometimes conflicted with Amazon ideals of honor and justice. Yet beneath their worldly cynicism, she sensed hearts that beat with genuine dedication to protecting the innocent and defeating evil, motivations that aligned closely with her own deepest convictions. The briefing that followed, conducted in a bombed-out building that had once housed a prestigious gentlemen's club, provided Diana with her first detailed understanding of the enemy they faced. The photographs and documents spread across makeshift tables painted a picture of systematic horror that challenged her faith in human nature concentration camps, where innocents were murdered by the thousands, experimental weapons designed to cause maximum suffering, propaganda campaigns that turned neighbor against neighbor with surgical precision. But it was when the discussion turned to the figure known as Dr. Poison, a brilliant chemist whose perverted genius had produced new forms of chemical warfare that could penetrate even the most advanced protective equipment, that Diana felt the first stirrings of true rage. Here was evil made manifest in human form, intelligence and scientific knowledge twisted into instruments of mass destruction, the violation of everything that knowledge and learning should represent. "She's working on something new," Steve explained, his face grim as he displayed reconnaissance photographs of a secret facility hidden in the German countryside. "Our intelligence suggests it's a gas that could kill millions, not just soldiers, but entire civilian populations. If she succeeds in perfecting it, this war could be over in a matter of weeks, with casualties beyond anything the world has ever seen." Diana studied the images with Amazon-trained eyes that could perceive details invisible to mortal vision. The facility itself was impressive in its scale and sophistication, but what drew her attention were the mystical emanations that seemed to cling to the very photographs, traces of supernatural influence that spoke of powers far beyond mere human evil. This was Ares' work, she realized with growing certainty, the war god's influence flowing through human instruments to achieve destruction on a scale that would feed his appetite for millennia to come. Her first public appearance as Wonder Woman, defending a group of Belgian refugees from a German patrol that had crossed into supposedly neutral territory, provided both triumph and education in the realities of modern warfare. The soldiers she faced were not the honorable warriors of Amazon training exercises, but men whose minds had been poisoned by ideology and fear, whose weapons spoke with the voice of mechanized death rather than honest steel. The fight itself was brief but decisive. Diana's speed allowed her to cross the battlefield faster than bullets could track her movement, while her bracelets turned aside, automatic weapons fire with showers of sparks that illuminated the night like deadly fireworks. Her lasso, glowing with divine truth, compelled honest answers from captured soldiers who revealed the location of nearby civilian populations marked for cleansing by advancing forces. Yet even in victory, Diana found herself troubled by questions that had no easy answers. These soldiers, despite their actions, were themselves victims of a system that had perverted their natural human capacity for good into instruments of evil. How could justice be served against men whose crimes stemmed from manipulation and indoctrination rather than personal malice? How could punishment be balanced against mercy when the true guilt lay with those who had corrupted minds and hearts that might otherwise have known peace? The rescued refugees, grateful beyond words for salvation they had not dared to hope for, provided Diana with her first taste of the adoration and fear that would follow her throughout her career. They saw in her not merely a savior, but something approaching divinity, made manifest a figure of such obvious power and grace that normal human categories seemed inadequate to contain her. Their reaction, a mixture of worship and terror that made her deeply uncomfortable, foreshadowed the complex relationship she would always maintain with the mortals she served. The journey to the secret facility where Dr. Poison conducted her obscene experiments took the small team through countryside that bore the scars of total war. Diana witnessed devastation that exceeded her darkest imaginings. Entire villages reduced to rubble, Forests stripped bare by chemical weapons, rivers running red with the blood of conflicts that seemed to serve no purpose beyond destruction itself. The very landscape seemed to cry out in pain, its natural harmony shattered by forces that recognized no limits, respected no boundaries, acknowledged no authority beyond the imperative of victory at any cost. As they approached their target, moving through war-torn terrain under cover of darkness, Diana felt the mystical emanations she had detected in the photographs growing stronger. This was indeed Ares's work, not his direct intervention, but his influence flowing through human agents who had opened their hearts to his whispered promises of power and glory. The war god, she realized, had learned to work more subtly than in ancient times, achieving greater destruction through human instruments than he had ever managed through direct divine intervention. The assault on the facility itself, when it came, was both a military operation and a spiritual battle that would define the nature of Diana's heroic mission. As she led her companions through defenses designed to repel conventional attack, using abilities that turned the very concept of conventional warfare into obsolete theory, she began to understand the true scope of the challenge she faced. This was not merely about stopping one madman or preventing one atrocity, but about confronting a corruption that had infected human civilization at its very roots. The confrontation with Dr. Poison, a brilliant woman whose mind had been twisted by exposure to powers beyond human comprehension, provided Diana with her first direct encounter with the seductive nature of evil itself. Here was someone who had once possessed the same gifts of intelligence and creativity that Diana associated with the greatest Amazon scholars, yet who had chosen to use those gifts in service of destruction rather than creation. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," the chemist declared, her voice carrying overtones that spoke of supernatural influence. "This war is merely the beginning. Humanity will tear itself apart with weapons that make my gas seem like a gentle breeze. I am simply hastening the inevitable, ensuring that the strong survive while the weak perish, as nature intended." Diana's response, delivered as she systematically destroyed the laboratory equipment that represented months of perverted research, carried all the moral authority of her Amazon heritage. Strength without compassion is not strength at all, but weakness disguised as power. True strength protects the innocent, nurtures the helpless, builds rather than destroys. What you call nature's law is nothing but the corruption of minds that have forgotten what it means to be truly human. The facility's destruction, achieved through a combination of Diana's supernatural abilities and carefully placed explosives provided by her companions, sent flames rising into the night sky that could be seen for miles. Yet even as she watched Dr. Poison's life work burning away to ash and memory, Diana understood that this victory, significant as it was, represented only the first step in a much longer journey. The war would continue. Other weapons would be developed. Other minds would be corrupted by the promise of power through destruction. And somewhere in the shadows of this embattled world, Ares himself waited with the patience of immortality, ready to pour his poison into any heart that opened itself to his influence. But Diana had also learned something crucial about the nature of heroism in this new world. It was not enough to possess power, she must learn to use that power wisely, understanding when force was necessary and when mercy would serve better. Knowing the difference between justice and vengeance, finding ways to heal as well as protect. The princess of Themyscira was beginning her transformation into Wonder Woman, champion not merely of the Amazons, but of all who sought peace in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The journey back to London, through countryside now slightly safer for her intervention, provided time for reflection on lessons learned and challenges yet to come. Steve Trevor, watching her process the experiences of her first mission into man's world, saw the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not merely Diana herself, but the very nature of heroism in a world that desperately needed new forms of hope. Behind them, the flames of the destroyed facility continued to burn, their light visible on the horizon like a beacon, announcing that something new had entered the world, a force for justice that would not be deterred by the magnitude of the evil it faced. A champion who would prove that even in the darkest of times, the light of truth and compassion could still shine through. The The transformation of Diana Prince from Amazon princess to Wonder Woman, champion of the free world, occurred not in a single moment of revelation, but through a series of trials that tested every aspect of her character against the grinding machinery of global warfare. As 1,941 melted into 1,942 and the conflict that would define a generation reached its most desperate phase, she found herself thrust into a role that transcended mere military action, becoming a living symbol of hope for millions who had begun to doubt that justice could triumph over the mechanized brutality of fascist aggression. Her official introduction to the American war effort came through channels that bypassed normal military protocol entirely. General Philip Darnell, a career soldier whose weathered face bore the marks of too many campaigns and too many losses, found himself confronted with reports that challenged everything he thought he knew about the possible and the practical. A woman who could deflect bullets with bracelets, who possessed strength that could overturn tanks, who moved with speed that made her nearly invisible to the human eye under normal circumstances. Such accounts would have been dismissed as combat fatigue or enemy propaganda. But the evidence was mounting too rapidly and from too many reliable sources to ignore. The first official meeting between Wonder Woman and the Allied command structure took place in a bunker deep beneath the Pentagon, where maps covered walls like geometric prayers to a god of strategy, and the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives. Diana, standing before an assembly of generals and admirals whose combined experience spanned decades of warfare, felt the full weight of their skepticism and desperate hope in equal measure. "Ma'am," General Darnell began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to expect the impossible during wartime. "We've received reports of your activities in the European theater. If even half of what we're hearing is true, you represent a strategic asset of incalculable value. But we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we can determine how best to utilize your capabilities." Diana's response, delivered with the diplomatic training that was as much a part of her Amazon education as combat skills, laid the foundation for a partnership that would reshape the course of the war. "General, I come not as a weapon to be deployed, but as an ally offering assistance in your fight against forces that threaten the very foundations of justice and freedom. I will not take orders that violate my principles, nor will I participate in actions that cause unnecessary suffering to innocents. But within those parameters, I offer my strength to your cause." The demonstration that followed, conducted in a specially prepared facility where Wonder Woman showcased abilities that defied every law of physics, the assembled military minds thought they understood, marked the beginning of a new chapter in warfare itself. Bullets crumpled against her bracelets like raindrops on stone. Her lasso glowed with inner light that compelled truth from hardened intelligence officers who had trained for years to resist interrogation. Her strength, tested against progressively heavier equipment, seemed to have no upper limit that conventional measurement could determine. But it was her speed that truly amazed the observers, not merely physical velocity, though she could indeed move faster than the eye could follow, but the speed of her tactical thinking, her ability to process battlefield information, and formulate responses in fractions of seconds that would have required minutes for even the most experienced military minds. Watching her navigate complex scenarios, simultaneously protecting civilians, neutralizing threats, and gathering intelligence, the generals began to understand that they were witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of warfare. The Justice Society of America, that loose confederation of extraordinary individuals who had begun to emerge as America's answer to the supernatural threats of the modern age, welcomed Wonder Woman with a mixture of relief and reverence that spoke to the desperate nature of the times. Dr. Fate, his golden helmet gleaming with ancient magics that rivaled even Amazon mysticism, recognized in her a kindred spirit, someone whose power came not from accident or mutation, but from divine purpose, carefully cultivated and responsibly wielded. Jay Garrick, the Flash, whose super speed had made him a legend among those who knew of such things, found in Diana someone who could actually keep pace with him in both physical and intellectual terms. Their early missions together, racing across battlefields to evacuate civilians faster than enemy forces could react, demonstrated the kind of coordinated superhuman action that would become the template for heroic teamwork in the decades to come. Alan Scott, the Green Lantern whose emerald power ring channeled willpower into constructs of pure energy, appreciated Diana's unwavering moral compass in situations where the boundaries between right and wrong had been blurred by the necessities of total war. Together, they developed strategies that minimized civilian casualties while maximizing the psychological impact on enemy forces, using their respective abilities to create displays of power that convinced entire units to surrender rather than face inevitable defeat. The Spectre, that grim figure whose very presence spoke of divine judgment made manifest, found in Wonder Woman someone who understood the weight of cosmic responsibility while maintaining the compassion necessary to wield such power wisely. Their philosophical discussions, conducted between missions that took them into the darkest corners of wartime Europe, explored questions of justice and mercy that would influence Diana's approach to heroism for decades to come. But it was Hawkman, the reincarnated warrior whose memories spanned millennia of conflict, who became Diana's closest confidant within the JSA. In him, she found someone who understood the burden of fighting the same battles across multiple lifetimes, who knew the weight of protecting a world that often seemed determined to destroy itself. Their partnership in the field combined his ancient tactical wisdom with her divine-blessed abilities to achieve victories that neither could have managed alone. The missions themselves ranged from the broadly strategic to the intensely personal, each one adding layers to the legend that Wonder Woman was becoming in the minds of both allies and enemies. The liberation of the concentration camp at Dachau, where her arrival interrupted a planned mass execution, demonstrated her capacity for righteous fury that even hardened SS officers found terrifying. The sight of Wonder Woman, her golden armor blazing with divine light, her lasso compelling truth from guards who had convinced themselves they were merely following orders, became a symbol of judgment that spread through the Nazi command structure like wildfire. Her infiltration of the German rocket program, using her invisible jet to penetrate defenses that conventional aircraft could never have breached, prevented the deployment of weapons that could have changed the entire trajectory of the war. Working alongside the Black Hawk Squadron, a group of elite pilots whose courage matched their skills, she destroyed production facilities and research installations with surgical precision that left nearby civilian populations unharmed while crippling the Nazi war machine's most advanced projects. The psychological warfare aspect of Wonder Woman's presence proved as valuable as her direct military contributions. Nazi propaganda, which had relied heavily on projecting images of Aryan superiority and inevitable victory, found itself confronted with an enemy who embodied ideals that their twisted ideologies simply could not comprehend or counter. Here was a woman who was clearly superior to any soldier they could field, yet who fought not for conquest, but for liberation, not for racial supremacy, but for universal justice. Dr. Goebbels himself, master of propaganda whose genius lay in his ability to twist truth into weapons of mass manipulation, found his carefully crafted narratives crumbling in the face of Wonder Woman's existence. How could the Reich claim that women were naturally inferior when this Amazon princess demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of their finest warriors? How could they maintain that might made right when she used her overwhelming power only to protect the weak and defend the innocent? The home front impact of Wonder Woman's presence proved equally significant. American women, inspired by news reports and newsreel footage of this female champion leading charges against fascist forces, began to see new possibilities for their own roles in the war effort. "We can do it" took on new meaning when backed by the visible proof that feminine strength could indeed change the world. Factory production increased as workers drew inspiration from Wonder Woman's example, while recruitment for women's auxiliary services reached record levels. Gloria Steinem would later write that Wonder Woman's emergence during World War II represented a crucial moment in the evolution of feminist consciousness. Not because she advocated for women's rights through speeches or political action, but because she simply existed, demonstrating through deed rather than word that traditional limitations on female capability were social constructions rather than natural law. The intelligence networks that grew up around Wonder Woman's activities represented another revolution in wartime operations. Her lasso's ability to compel truth from prisoners made conventional interrogation techniques obsolete. while her speed and stealth capabilities allowed for reconnaissance missions that provided unprecedented insight into enemy plans and capabilities. The Ultra program, already providing crucial intelligence through code-breaking efforts, found its effectiveness multiplied by Wonder Woman's ability to confirm or clarify decoded information through direct observation and captured enemy testimony. Her relationship with Steve Trevor, evolving from initial attraction through shared danger into something approaching true partnership, provided emotional grounding that kept her connected to human concerns, even as her responsibilities grew increasingly cosmic in scope. Steve's role evolved from mere liaison officer to trusted advisor, whose understanding of both military strategy and political necessity helped Diana navigate the complex realities of fighting a war while maintaining her moral principles. The Christmas truce of 1944, when Wonder Woman's intervention prevented a planned massacre of Allied prisoners in the Ardennes, demonstrated the full scope of her impact on the conflict's trajectory. Using her invisible jet to reach the isolated prison camp ahead of rescue forces, she found herself confronting not merely German guards but SS executioners whose orders came directly from Hitler himself: kill all prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated by advancing Allied forces. The battle that followed, conducted in a forest clearing while snow fell like divine benediction, pitted Wonder Woman against odds that would have challenged even her considerable abilities. Outnumbered 50-1, facing enemies armed with the most advanced weapons Nazi science could produce, she fought not merely for victory, but for the principle that even in the darkest of wars, some lines could not be crossed without forfeiting all claim to humanity. Her victory, achieved through a combination of tactical brilliance and supernatural ability that left observers struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed, saved the lives of more than 300 Allied prisoners, while demonstrating to friend and foe alike that there existed forces in the world that no amount of military technology could overcome. The psychological impact on German morale, already weakened by months of retreat and defeat, proved devastating. If their most advanced forces could not stand against this single champion, what hope did they have against the Allied armies that would soon follow? As 1945 dawned, and the war entered its final phase, Wonder Woman found herself serving not merely as military asset but as symbol of everything the conflict had ultimately been about: the triumph of justice over tyranny, of compassion over cruelty, of hope over despair. Her presence at the liberation of the death camps, her role in protecting displaced persons from post-war chaos, her insistence that former enemies be treated according to the principles of civilized justice rather than vengeful retribution, all contributed to a vision of victory that transcended mere military success. But even as Allied victory became inevitable, Diana sensed darker currents flowing beneath the surface of apparent triumph. The atomic weapons that ended the Pacific War demonstrated humanity's capacity for destruction on a scale that dwarfed even Nazi ambitions, while the emerging tensions between former allies suggested that peace would be merely an interlude between conflicts rather than the lasting resolution she had hoped to achieve. The war god's influence, she realized, had not been defeated but merely redirected. Where Ares had once worked through fascist ideology to promote conflict, he would now find new channels: ideological divisions between East and West, nuclear arsenals that could destroy civilization itself, proxy wars that would consume entire regions while superpowers maintained the fiction of peace. The victory achieved through so much sacrifice was real but incomplete, the beginning of a longer struggle rather than its conclusion. As Wonder Woman stood among the celebrations that marked the war's end, watching crowds rejoice in streets that had known too much sorrow, she understood that her mission was evolving beyond anything she had originally imagined. She had come to man's world to fight a war, but she would stay to win a peace, not the simple absence of conflict, but the positive presence of justice that would make future wars impossible. The Amazon princess had become something unprecedented in human history, a champion whose power served principle rather than nation, whose loyalty belonged to justice rather than ideology, whose mission transcended the political boundaries that had traditionally defined heroism. Wonder Woman, forged in the crucible of global conflict, emerged from World War II, ready to face whatever challenges the atomic age might bring. The first signs of Ares' renewed presence in the mortal realm came not as declarations of war or manifestations of divine power, but as whispers in the shadows of the post-war world, subtle influences that turned ally against ally, friend against friend, hope against hope. Wonder Woman felt his malevolent touch like ice against her Amazon-trained senses, a corruption that spread through human hearts with the patience of eternity and the certainty of gravity. The war god had learned cunning during his long exile from direct intervention, discovering that mortal pawns could achieve greater destruction than divine manifestation had ever managed. Diana first recognized the pattern during a routine mission in occupied Berlin, where the delicate work of denazification had begun to fracture along lines that made no strategic sense. American and Soviet forces, nominally allies in the Great Crusade against fascism, found themselves viewing each other with suspicion that escalated daily into something approaching hostility. Intelligence officers who had cooperated effectively throughout the war suddenly reported conflicting objectives, while military commanders discovered irreconcilable differences in policies that had seemed aligned only weeks before. The invisible threads of divine manipulation were subtle enough to escape mortal notice, but Diana's enhanced perception, trained by centuries of Amazon mysticism, detected the supernatural signatures that clung to these conflicts like spiritual fingerprints. This was not mere political disagreement or cultural misunderstanding. This was orchestrated discord, carefully cultivated by an intelligence that understood human nature's capacity for fear and hatred, that knew exactly which pressures to apply to transform cooperation into competition, alliance into antagonism. Dr. Fate, consulted through mystical channels that bypassed normal communication entirely, confirmed Diana's growing suspicions with information that chilled even her Amazon-steeled heart. The war god walks among mortals once again, the Lord of Order intoned, his voice carrying overtones of cosmic authority that spoke across dimensional barriers. But he has learned subtlety working through human agents who may not even realize they serve his purpose, turning the very peace we fought to achieve into the foundation of future conflicts. The revelation that Ares had returned to active involvement in human affairs struck the Justice Society like a thunderbolt from clear skies. These heroes, who had faced down everything from rampaging monsters to Nazi superweapons, found themselves confronting an enemy whose very existence challenged their understanding of reality itself. How did one fight a god whose battlefield was the human heart, whose weapons were doubt and fear and hatred, whose victory condition was not conquest, but chaos? Alan Scott, his emerald ring blazing with willpower-fueled energy, posed the question that haunted all their discussions. If this war god can influence minds and hearts without direct confrontation, how do we even know our own thoughts are our own? How can we trust our strategies when our enemy might be feeding us the very plans we think we're developing to defeat him? The answer, when it came, emerged from Diana's unique position as bridge between divine and mortal realms. Her Amazon heritage granted her insights into the nature of divine manipulation that even other mystically powered heroes could not match, while her experience in man's world provided understanding of human psychology that pure immortals often lacked. Ares was powerful, perhaps more powerful than any individual hero could match in direct confrontation. But he was not omnipotent. His influence required willing vessels, hearts already open to the poisons he offered. He cannot corrupt what remains pure, Diana explained to her assembled colleagues, her voice carrying the authority of inherited wisdom and hard-earned experience. The war god's power flows through existing channels of hatred and fear. He amplifies what is already present, rather than creating something entirely new. Our defense, therefore, must be to purify those channels, to offer alternatives to the darkness he represents. The strategy that emerged from these discussions was unlike anything the Justice Society had attempted before, a campaign fought not on battlefields, but in human hearts, not with weapons, but with hope, not for territory, but for the very soul of civilization itself. They would combat Ares' influence by demonstrating alternatives to conflict, by showing humanity that its better angels could indeed triumph over its baser instincts, by proving that cooperation and compassion were not mere idealistic fantasies but practical tools for building a better world. Wonder Woman's role in this unprecedented campaign drew upon every aspect of her unique abilities and training. Her lasso, blazing with divine truth that could cut through any deception, became an instrument of revelation rather than mere interrogation, compelling not just honesty about facts, but honesty about motivations, forcing corrupted individuals to confront the true sources of their actions and choices. Time and again, she used this gift to expose the supernatural influences that had twisted human judgment, freeing minds from manipulation they had not even realized they were experiencing. Her diplomatic training, inherited from centuries of Amazon tradition and refined through hard experience in the complex politics of wartime alliance, proved equally crucial, working through United Nations channels that were still forming in the aftermath of global conflict. She helped draft protocols for international cooperation that explicitly addressed the psychological dimensions of lasting peace. These documents, revolutionary in their recognition that political structures alone could not prevent war, established frameworks for cultural exchange and educational cooperation, designed to build understanding that transcended national boundaries. But it was her role as symbol and inspiration that proved most important in the struggle against Ares' influence. Wonder Woman's very existence challenged the war god's fundamental premise that conflict was inevitable, that violence was natural, that peace was merely an interlude between episodes of necessary destruction. Here was a warrior of unmatched capability who chose restraint over dominance, protection over conquest, healing over destruction. Her example provided moral authority that mere rhetoric could never achieve. The first direct confrontation between Wonder Woman and Ares came not in some cosmic arena removed from mortal concerns, but in the rubble-strewn streets of a city where the war god had chosen to make his stand. The location itself was symbolic, not Berlin or Tokyo, where human conflict had reached its most devastating expression, but a smaller city whose name would be forgotten by history, where the real business of building peace was being conducted by ordinary people trying to reconstruct their lives after years of war. Here, Ares had established his presence through a cell of fanatical followers who styled themselves as defenders of racial purity and national honor, but who served primarily as conduits for the divine poison that fed their master's appetite for chaos. These were not the obvious villains of wartime propaganda, uniformed soldiers following clearly evil leaders, but seemingly normal citizens whose fears and prejudices had been cultivated into weapons of mass psychological destruction. The battle, when it finally erupted, transcended every category of conflict that Wonder Woman had previously experienced. Ares appeared not in his traditional form as armored war god, but as something far more insidious, a figure of compelling charisma, whose very presence made violence seem not merely acceptable but necessary, whose words carried supernatural persuasion that could turn neighbor against neighbor with surgical precision. "You understand nothing of human nature, Amazon," he declared, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the darkest corners of mortal psychology. "I do not create the hatred that drives men to war. I merely reveal what was always present, give expression to truths that your naive idealism refuses to acknowledge. Humans are killers by nature, conquerors by instinct. I am not their corrupter, but their liberator, freeing them from the artificial constraints that deny their true selves." Diana's response came not through words but through demonstration, a display of power used not to dominate but to protect, strength employed not to destroy but to defend. As Ares' followers, driven by supernatural compulsion that overrode their normal moral restraints, attacked the innocent civilians they had been programmed to hate, Wonder Woman interposed herself between aggressor and victim with precision that preserved life on both sides of the conflict. Her lasso, glowing with truth that burned away deception like fire-consuming chaff, wrapped around Ares himself with bonds that could not be broken by mere physical force. For the first time in millennia, the war god found himself compelled to speak honestly about his motivations and methods, his ancient pride forcing him to reveal truths that his very nature had kept hidden. "You think yourself so pure, so righteous," he snarled, his divine form writhing against bonds that tightened with each attempt to escape. "But you are warrior-born, shaped by conflict, defined by opposition. Without enemies to fight, heroes to oppose, what purpose would you serve? You need war as much as I do. The only difference is that I admit the truth, while you hide behind pretty lies about justice and peace." The revelation that followed, as Wonder Woman's lasso compelled deeper honesty than even Ares had intended to reveal, exposed the cosmic scope of his manipulations across centuries of human history. Every great conflict, from the Trojan War to the World War just concluded, had borne his fingerprints, not as creator but as amplifier, not as instigator but as accelerant, turning minor disputes into massive conflagrations that fed his appetite for chaos, while convincing mortals that such destruction was inevitable. But the deeper truth that emerged challenged assumptions that had guided human thinking about war and peace for millennia. Ares was not some external force imposing conflict upon innocent humanity. He was a reflection of something within human nature itself, the shadow side of the same impulses that drove creativity and growth and progress. The capacity for war and the capacity for peace came from the same source, and eliminating one would inevitably diminish the other. "You cannot destroy me without destroying part of yourselves," Ares declared, his voice carrying the authority of cosmic law rather than mere divine threat. "I am woven into the very fabric of mortal existence, the competition that drives innovation, the conflict that sparks growth, the struggle that gives meaning to victory. Remove war entirely, and you remove the possibility of genuine peace." Diana's response to this revelation demonstrated wisdom that transcended her years of experience, insight that came not from Amazon training alone, but from the unique perspective of one who had lived in both divine and mortal realms. "You speak truth, but not the whole truth," she declared, her voice carrying certainty that came from hard-won understanding. "Yes, conflict is part of growth, competition part of progress. But war is not the only form conflict can take. Violence, not the only expression of competition. The struggles that matter most are fought not between armies but within individual hearts, battles between selfishness and compassion, between fear and courage, between despair and hope." The philosophical confrontation that followed, conducted while the physical battle raged around them, addressed questions that had puzzled theologians and philosophers since the dawn of consciousness. Could humanity transcend its capacity for violence without losing its capacity for growth? Was it possible to harness the competitive drives that fueled progress while channeling them toward constructive rather than destructive ends? Could the species that had just demonstrated its ability to destroy entire cities with atomic fire learn to direct that same energy toward building rather than breaking? Ares, bound by truth-compelling magic that stripped away millennia of divine deception, found himself articulating insights that challenged his own fundamental nature. Perhaps, he admitted with obvious reluctance, there might be forms of conflict that strengthen rather than destroy, competitions that elevate rather than diminish. But such evolution would require transformation not just of human institutions, but of human nature itself, and that kind of change comes slowly, if at all. The battle's resolution came not through Diana's defeat of Ares, for how could one truly defeat a force that was woven into the very fabric of existence, but through her demonstration of alternatives to the patterns he represented. Using her divine heritage and Amazon training in ways that transcended mere combat, she showed both the war god and his human followers possibilities they had never imagined. Strength used in service of protection rather than domination. Competition channeled toward mutual elevation rather than mutual destruction. Conflict transformed into collaboration. The liberation of Ares' followers from his supernatural influence proved to be a gradual process that required not just the breaking of mystical bonds, but the healing of psychological wounds that had made them vulnerable to corruption. In the first place, Diana's work with these former fanatics, helping them understand how their legitimate fears and concerns had been manipulated into weapons of hatred, provided insights into the nature of divine influence that would guide her actions for decades to come. Ares himself, neither defeated nor triumphant, withdrew from direct confrontation, with a warning that carried the weight of prophecy. "This is not ended, Amazon. As long as mortals carry the capacity for violence within their hearts, I will find ways to manifest that potential. You may have won this battle by showing them alternatives, but the war between order and chaos, between construction and destruction, between peace and conflict, is eternal. We will meet again when they forget the lessons you have taught them." The aftermath of the confrontation left Wonder Woman with responsibilities that extended far beyond those of a conventional hero. She had proven that Ares could be opposed, his influence countered, his manipulations exposed and defeated. But she had also learned that such victories were temporary unless supported by fundamental changes in human consciousness, changes that would require not just heroic intervention, but sustained effort across generations to achieve. The work of building genuine peace, she realized, was far more difficult than winning wars. It required not just the defeat of obvious enemies, but the transformation of the conditions that made such enemies possible in the first place. It demanded not just the protection of the innocent, but the education of the ignorant, not just the punishment of the guilty, but the healing of the wounded, not just the prevention of violence, but the cultivation of wisdom. As she stood among the ruins of the battlefield where gods and mortals had clashed over the future of human civilization, Diana understood that her mission was evolving once again. She had come to man's world as a warrior, had developed into a champion, and now found herself called to serve as something unprecedented in the history of heroism. A guardian not just of peace, but of the possibility of peace. A protector, not just of the innocent, but of innocence itself. The war god would return, as he had promised. Human nature would continue to generate the conflicts that fed his power. But Wonder Woman would be waiting, armed not just with divine strength and Amazon training, but with the knowledge that even gods could be taught better ways, that even the most ancient patterns could be changed, that hope itself was a weapon more powerful than any forged in the fires of war. The late 1960s brought winds of change that swept across America like hurricanes of consciousness, tearing down established certainties and demanding new answers to old questions. Wonder Woman, who had stood as an unshakable symbol of justice and feminine strength through 2 decades of post-war stability, suddenly found herself caught in currents of cultural transformation that challenged not just her methods, but her very reason for existence. The world she had fought to protect was questioning everything she represented, while the society she served struggled to reconcile its heroic fantasies with the harsh realities of social revolution, generational conflict, and an increasingly complex understanding of what justice actually meant. The crisis began not on any battlefield, but in the offices of DC Comics, where editors and writers grappled with declining sales and letters from readers who found Wonder Woman's traditional adventures increasingly irrelevant to their contemporary concerns. The Amazon princess, who had once embodied the aspirations of women entering the workforce during World War II, now seemed outdated to a generation that questioned authority, challenged traditional gender roles, and demanded representation that reflected their own struggles for identity and meaning. Dr. Frederick Wortham's influential critique of comic books as contributing to juvenile delinquency had already forced the industry to adopt restrictive content codes that neutered much of the medium's dramatic potential. Wonder Woman, whose stories had always balanced action with moral instruction, found herself constrained by guidelines that seemed designed to eliminate precisely the kind of strong, independent female character she represented. Editorial mandates demanded that her adventures focus on romance and domesticity, rather than heroic achievement, while marketing departments worried that her Amazonian background was too fantastic for modern audiences seeking realistic role models. The solution proposed by writer Dennis O'Neil and editor Julius Schwartz was radical beyond anything attempted in the character's history, a complete reimagining that would strip away Wonder Woman's divine heritage, supernatural abilities, and connection to Themyscira itself. In this new interpretation, Diana Prince would become a mortal woman learning martial arts and espionage techniques, fighting crime through skill and determination rather than Amazon birthright and mystical artifacts. The goal was to create a character who could serve as inspiration for contemporary women without relying on fantasy elements that seemed increasingly divorced from real-world concerns. The transformation, when it was implemented in Wonder Woman 178, represented nothing less than the destruction of everything that had defined the character for 3 decades. Diana's mother Hippolyta appeared in a vision to declare that the Amazons were departing this dimension entirely, leaving their princess behind, to continue the mission of promoting justice and equality through purely human means. The golden armor, the invisible jet, the lasso of truth, all vanished as Diana chose to remain in man's world rather than accompany her sisters to their new mystical realm. What emerged from this radical reinvention was a character caught between worlds in ways that no Amazon princess had ever experienced. Diana Prince, now mortal and vulnerable, found herself studying under the guidance of I Ching, a blind Asian mentor whose wisdom emphasized spiritual discipline and martial arts mastery over supernatural intervention. Her new adventures, set against the backdrop of late 1960s counterculture, involved fighting crime syndicates and international conspiracies through detective work, hand-to-hand combat, and technological gadgets rather than divine intervention. The mod fashions and contemporary styling that accompanied this transformation reflected editorial attempts to make Wonder Woman relevant to audiences who viewed traditional superhero costumes as symbols of an establishment they were actively rejecting. Diana's new wardrobe miniskirts, go-go boots, and martial arts uniforms was designed to show that female strength could be fashionable and contemporary, rather than mythological and timeless. The message was clear. Heroism belonged not to distant gods and ancient legends, but to ordinary people willing to stand up for their principles in the real world. Yet, this attempt at modernization created as many problems as it solved. Readers who had grown up with the iconic Wonder Woman found themselves confronted with a character who bore no resemblance to the hero they remembered and cherished. The Amazon princess, who had stood as equal to Superman and Batman, had been replaced by a mortal woman whose capabilities, however impressive by human standards, seemed diminished in comparison to her former divine might. The mythological richness that had distinguished Wonder Woman from other characters was abandoned in favor of generic spy adventures that could have featured any protagonist. More problematically, the transformation occurred precisely at the moment when the women's liberation movement was beginning to challenge the fundamental assumptions about female roles that had shaped American society since its founding. Women were demanding not just equal treatment, but recognition of their inherent strength and capability, exactly the qualities that the original Wonder Woman had embodied through her Amazon heritage and divine blessings. To strip away these fantastical elements just as real women were asserting their own fantastic capabilities seemed to many observers like a retreat from, rather than an embrace of progressive values. Gloria Steinem, whose feminist consciousness had been shaped partly by childhood reading of Wonder Woman comics, recognized the symbolic significance of this editorial decision and its potential impact on the broader cultural conversation about women's roles and capabilities. In a 1,972 essay that became a rallying cry for both comic book fans and feminist activists, she wrote, "Wonder Woman's golden lasso compels people to tell the truth, including the truth about their own capabilities, and the truth about social barriers that prevent them from achieving their potential. To take away her lasso is to take away one of the few symbols in popular culture that suggests women's strength can be extraordinary rather than merely adequate." The campaign that followed Steinem's intervention represented an unprecedented collision between comic book fandom and political activism. Letters poured into DC Comics, from readers who demanded the restoration of Wonder Woman's traditional powers and mythological background, while feminist organizations adopted the character as a symbol of female empowerment that was being systematically dismantled by male editors, who failed to understand what she represented to women seeking inspiration for their own struggles. The cultural significance of this controversy extended far beyond the comics industry itself. Wonder Woman had become, in ways that her creators might never have anticipated, a lightning rod for broader debates about female identity in a rapidly changing society. The question of whether she should be portrayed as an ordinary woman, achieving extraordinary things through training and determination, or as an extraordinary woman using supernatural gifts in service of justice, reflected deeper uncertainties about how women should understand their own potential and the obstacles they faced in realizing it. Academic critics, entering the conversation from perspectives informed by emerging feminist theory and media studies, argued that the depowering of Wonder Woman represented a classic example of patriarchal anxiety about female strength. Dr. Lillian Robinson, writing in the journal Women's Studies, observed, "The editorial decision to make Wonder Woman more realistic reveals deep discomfort with the possibility that women might possess capabilities that exceed rather than merely equal those of men. By insisting that female heroism must be grounded in plausible human limitation rather than mythological transcendence, the comics industry reveals its own investment in maintaining gender hierarchies even within fantasy narratives. The artistic and narrative quality of the depowered Wonder Woman stories, while competently executed within their own parameters, suffered from the loss of the mythological framework that had given the character her distinctive identity. I Ching, despite being portrayed with respect and cultural sensitivity unusual for the era, could not provide the same narrative richness as Diana's Amazon heritage and divine connections. The spy adventures and crime-fighting scenarios, however well crafted, lacked the cosmic significance that had distinguished Wonder Woman's traditional adventures from those of countless other urban vigilantes. Diana's relationship with Steve Trevor, reimagined as a more contemporary romance between equals rather than the mythic love between immortal and mortal, gained psychological realism at the cost of epic grandeur. The new dynamic reflected changing social attitudes about gender relations and romantic partnership, but it also reduced wonder and magic to mundane compatibility issues that could have been explored in any romantic drama. The absence of Themyscira itself proved particularly damaging to the character's long-term narrative potential. Without her Amazon homeland as a source of wisdom, strength, and moral guidance, Diana became essentially rootless, a lone individual whose heroic mission lacked the institutional support and cultural context that had originally given it weight and meaning. The Justice League, the United Nations, and various government agencies could provide tactical assistance, but none could replace the spiritual foundation that Amazonian civilization had provided. Sales figures during this period told their own story of reader dissatisfaction and cultural disconnect. Wonder Woman's circulation, which had already been declining due to broader changes in the comics market, continued to fall as traditional fans abandoned the title, while new readers failed to embrace the reimagined character. The mod styling and contemporary settings that were supposed to attract young female readers proved insufficient to compensate for the loss of the mythological elements that had given the character her distinctive appeal. The psychological impact on Diana herself, as portrayed within the narrative, reflected the broader cultural confusion surrounding women's roles during this period of rapid social change. Stripped of her divine heritage and Amazon training, she struggled to define her identity and purpose in ways that paralleled the real-world experiences of women who were questioning traditional expectations, while searching for new models of female achievement and fulfillment. The turning point came not from any single editorial decision, but from the accumulated weight of criticism, declining sales, and the recognition that the depowering experiment had failed to achieve its stated goals. The restoration of Wonder Woman's traditional powers and mythological background, beginning in Wonder Woman 204, was presented as Diana's reunion with her Amazon heritage, after a period of necessary growth and learning in the mortal world. The return to form, however, could not simply erase the 3 years during which Wonder Woman had existed as a fundamentally different character. The experience had demonstrated both the character's resilience and her vulnerability, her ability to maintain reader interest and cultural relevance even when stripped of her defining characteristics, but also the fundamental importance of those characteristics to her long-term viability as a symbol and inspiration. The restored Wonder Woman emerged from this crisis transformed in subtle but significant ways. Her renewed connection to Themyscira carried deeper appreciation for the privileges and responsibilities of her Amazon heritage, while her experience as a mortal woman had given her new understanding of the challenges faced by those who lacked superhuman abilities. The synthesis of divine power and human perspective created a more complex and nuanced character whose adventures could address both mythological themes and contemporary social issues. The lessons learned during this period of experimentation and restoration would influence Wonder Woman's portrayal for decades to come. Creators and editors gained new appreciation for the delicate balance required to maintain the character's essential nature while adapting her to changing cultural contexts. The mythological elements that some had viewed as outdated proved to be timeless rather than temporal, capable of speaking to universal human concerns that transcended any particular historical moment. Most importantly, the identity crisis of the late 1960s and early 1970s established Wonder Woman as more than mere entertainment. She had become a cultural touchstone whose treatment reflected broader social attitudes about women, power, and the relationship between fantasy and reality. The controversy surrounding her depowering and restoration demonstrated that fictional characters could carry real-world significance that extended far beyond their original commercial purposes. As the 1970s progressed and Wonder Woman reclaimed her position as the premier female superhero, the lessons of her temporary transformation continued to resonate. The character had survived an attempt to remake her completely, emerging stronger and more culturally significant than before. She had proven that some symbols are too important to abandon, some myths too powerful to diminish, some truths too fundamental to compromise. The Amazon princess who entered the final quarter of the 20th century was both ancient and modern, mythological and contemporary, divine and deeply human. She had faced the ultimate test of character, the question of whether she could remain relevant without abandoning her essential nature, and had emerged victorious. The stage was set for her greatest adventures yet to come. The cosmic catastrophe known as Crisis on Infinite Earths shattered more than just the boundaries between parallel dimensions. It shattered the very foundations upon which decades of superhero mythology had been built. When the smoke cleared and reality reassembled itself into new configurations that both honored and revolutionized established continuity, Wonder Woman found herself facing the most profound transformation in her existence. Since that first moment when divine breath had animated Hippolyta's clay sculpture. This was not merely editorial revision, but cosmic recreation, an opportunity to rebuild the Amazon princess from the ground up with the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of storytelling and the fresh perspective that only complete reinvention could provide. George Perez, the artist-turned-writer whose vision would guide this renaissance, approached Wonder Woman with the reverence of a scholar and the passion of a true believer. His childhood fascination with Greek mythology, combined with his artistic sensibilities and deep understanding of visual storytelling, created the perfect foundation for a relaunch that would honor the character's legacy while establishing new possibilities for growth and development. Perez understood that Wonder Woman was not merely a superhero, but a mythological figure whose stories needed to resonate on both human and cosmic levels. The post-crisis Wonder Woman emerged from her cocoon of continuity, like a butterfly whose wings had been painted by gods themselves. Every aspect of her origin and background was reconsidered and refined, from the mystical properties of Themyscira itself to the complex relationships between the Olympian gods who had shaped Amazon civilization. This was not the relatively simple Paradise Island of earlier stories, but a fully realized society with its own history, politics, culture, and internal contradictions that reflected the complexity of any civilization that had endured for millennia. Themyscira itself became a character in its own right under Perez's guidance, a living island whose every feature spoke of divine intervention and Amazon achievement in equal measure. The architecture blended classical Greek influences with innovations that could only have emerged from a society of immortal women, whose artistic vision had been refined across centuries of peaceful development. Marble temples gleamed with inner light that came not from mere craftsmanship, but from the divine blessings that infused every stone, while training grounds and libraries represented the twin pillars of Amazon civilization, martial excellence and intellectual achievement. The Amazons themselves gained depth and complexity that had been missing from many previous portrayals. These were not merely warriors who happened to be women, but individuals whose personalities and perspectives had been shaped by unique historical experiences that no mortal society could parallel. Philippus, the captain of the guard, embodied military excellence tempered by centuries of wisdom about the true costs of conflict. Epione, the chief healer, represented the nurturing aspects of Amazon culture that balanced their martial traditions. Menelippe, the oracle, served as conduit for divine wisdom while struggling with the burden of prophetic knowledge that revealed futures both glorious and terrible. Diana's birth, as reimagined by Perez, became a cosmic event that resonated across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The clay from which she was sculpted was not ordinary earth but sacred soil that had absorbed the essence of every Amazon who had ever lived, while the divine breath that gave her life carried with it the accumulated hopes and dreams of her people. This was not mere magical animation, but the culmination of millennia of preparation, the fulfillment of prophecies that had guided Amazon development since their earliest days. The gods who blessed Diana's creation were portrayed with complexity that acknowledged both their divine nature and their very human flaws and limitations. Zeus appeared not as distant patriarch, but as a figure struggling to balance his responsibilities as king of the gods with his genuine affection for the mortal realm. Athena's wisdom was tempered by strategic thinking that sometimes required difficult choices, while Aphrodite's gift of love carried with it the understanding that love without strength was merely sentiment, strength without love, merely brutality. Ares, reconceived as Diana's primary antagonist, became a figure of tragic grandeur whose opposition to the Amazons stemmed not from simple malice, but from fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of existence itself. His belief that conflict was the driving force of evolution and progress stood in direct opposition to the Amazon ideal of growth through cooperation and wisdom, creating dramatic tension that went far beyond mere good versus evil into questions of cosmic purpose and meaning. The early adventures of this new Wonder Woman demonstrated the full scope of Perez's vision, weaving together mythological themes with contemporary concerns in ways that honored both classical traditions and modern sensibilities. Diana's first encounter with the modern world was not a simple matter of culture shock, but a complex process of mutual discovery as she learned about human civilization while teaching humanity about possibilities they had forgotten or never imagined. Her relationship with Julia and Vanessa Capitelis provided emotional grounding that had been missing from many previous interpretations of the character. Julia, the archaeologist whose scholarly interests aligned with Diana's mythological origins, became both friend and cultural interpreter, helping the Amazon princess navigate the complexities of modern academic and social life. Young Vanessa, approaching adolescence with all the uncertainties and dreams that entailed, found in Diana a role model who embodied strength without sacrificing femininity, power without abandoning compassion. The villains that emerged during this period reflected the thematic sophistication that Perez brought to every aspect of the relaunch. The cheetah, reimagined as Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva, became a figure whose transformation from respected archaeologist to savage predator paralleled Diana's own journey from sheltered princess to world-spanning hero, but with opposite moral outcomes. Where Diana used her powers to protect and nurture, the cheetah embodied the corruption that came from seeking power for its own sake, rather than in service of higher principles. Circe, the sorceress whose mastery of transformation magic made her one of the few beings capable of challenging Wonder Woman on equal terms, represented the seductive nature of shortcuts to power and the dangers of allowing intelligence to become disconnected from wisdom. Her schemes often forced Diana to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between divine blessing and personal responsibility, between inherited privilege and earned authority. Dr. Psycho, the telepathic misogynist whose hatred of women stemmed from his own psychological inadequacies, served as a dark mirror of the very prejudices and limitations that Wonder Woman had been created to oppose. His battles with Diana were fought as much on psychological and philosophical grounds as physical ones, forcing her to defend not just her own principles, but the possibility that those principles could triumph in a world that often seemed designed to reward cynicism and cruelty. The mythological scope of Perez's stories allowed for adventures that spanned multiple realms of existence, from the depths of Hades to the heights of Olympus, from the mortal world to dimensions where abstract concepts took on physical form. Diana found herself serving not just as superhero but as diplomat, mediating between pantheons of gods whose ancient rivalries threatened to spill over into the mortal realm with catastrophic consequences. Her role in the Olympian civil war that erupted when Zeus temporarily abdicated his throne demonstrated the full scope of her evolved character. This was not simply a matter of choosing sides in a divine conflict, but of finding ways to preserve what was valuable in the old order, while allowing for necessary change and growth. Diana's solutions often required her to challenge both traditional authorities and revolutionary alternatives, seeking middle paths that honored valid concerns from all parties while preventing the kind of destruction that would serve no one's interests. The visual presentation of these stories, brought to life through Perez's meticulous artwork and passionate attention to detail, established new standards for how mythological themes could be incorporated into superhero narratives. Every panel was composed with the understanding that these were not merely adventure stories, but modern myths that needed to speak to contemporary audiences while honoring ancient truths about human nature and divine purpose. Diana's costume, redesigned with subtle but significant modifications, became a perfect fusion of classical and contemporary elements. The golden eagle that adorned her breastplate was not merely decorative but symbolic, representing the soaring vision that lifted Amazon ideals above mundane concerns. The star-spangled skirt spoke of her role as ambassador to America, specifically, and the mortal world generally, while the silver bracelets carried the weight of Amazon history and the promise of Amazon protection. The invisible jet, reimagined as a gift of Amazonian technology that blended mysticism with advanced engineering, became more than mere transportation, but a symbol of Diana's ability to move between worlds while remaining grounded in her own principles and purposes. Its transparency represented the clarity of vision that allowed her to see through deceptions and illusions to the truth that lay beneath surface appearances. As the post-crisis Wonder Woman established herself in the pantheon of DC's premier heroes, her relationships with Superman and Batman evolved beyond mere colleague status into something approaching mythological significance. With Superman, she shared an understanding of what it meant to be an outsider who had chosen to protect a world that was not originally their own, while with Batman, she found common ground in their mutual dedication to justice, tempered by very different approaches to achieving it. The trinity that these three characters formed was not merely editorial convenience, but recognition of archetypal roles that resonated across cultures and throughout history. The idealist, the pragmatist, and the warrior philosopher whose strength was matched by wisdom. Their team-ups became opportunities to explore how different approaches to heroism could complement rather than compete with each other, how diverse perspectives could strengthen rather than weaken collective efforts to protect and serve. Diana's role in the founding of the new Justice League reflected her evolved status as not just a powerful hero, but a natural leader, whose diplomatic skills and moral authority made her invaluable in situations that required more than mere force to resolve. Her ability to find common ground between conflicting parties, to see the valid concerns that lay beneath surface disagreements, to build consensus without compromising principles, made her the heart of a team that might otherwise have fractured under the weight of its own diverse personalities and approaches. The embassy that Diana established in New York City became more than mere headquarters, but a symbol of what Amazon ideals could offer to the modern world. Part diplomatic mission, part cultural center, part sanctuary for those seeking justice in a world that often seemed to have forgotten the meaning of the word, the embassy represented possibility, made manifest proof that ancient wisdom could address contemporary problems, that mythological truth could guide modern decision-making. As the 1980s drew to a close, and the 1990s approached with their own challenges and opportunities, the post-crisis Wonder Woman had achieved something unprecedented in the character's history: complete integration of mythological grandeur with contemporary relevance, perfect balance between divine power and human compassion, seamless fusion of classical heroism with modern sensibilities. She had become not just a character but a cultural force, not just a hero but a symbol of what heroism could mean in an age that desperately needed new forms of inspiration and hope. The foundation that Perez had laid would support decades of future development, providing a template for how mythological characters could remain relevant without abandoning their essential nature, how ancient truths could speak to modern concerns without losing their timeless power. Wonder Woman had been reborn not just as hero but as eternal champion, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with wisdom inherited from the past and strength drawn from the eternal wellspring of justice itself. The architecture of heroism is built not merely upon individual strength or solitary moral conviction, but upon the complex web of relationships that sustain champions through their darkest hours and elevate their triumphs beyond personal achievement into something approaching mythological significance. Wonder Woman's journey from isolated Amazon princess to global icon was shaped as much by the allies who stood beside her, the friends who grounded her humanity, and the enemies who tested her principles, as by her own divine heritage and trained capabilities. These relationships, forged in the crucible of conflict and tempered by shared sacrifice, became the foundation upon which her legend would be built and the lens through which her true character would be revealed. Steve Trevor remained the most complex and enduring of these connections, a relationship that transcended simple romantic categories to become something unprecedented in the annals of heroic literature. Their bond, initiated by chance when his aircraft crashed through Themyscira's mystical barriers, evolved through decades of shared adventure into a partnership that challenged traditional concepts of both heroic romance and military cooperation. Steve's role as Diana's introduction to man's world made him more than lover or ally. He became her anchor to humanity, the mortal perspective that kept her divine powers connected to earthly concerns and prevented her godlike abilities from isolating her from the people she served. The evolution of their relationship reflected broader changes in society's understanding of gender roles and romantic partnership. In the early years, Steve often found himself cast in the traditionally feminine role of victim, requiring rescue, while Diana wielded power and authority typically associated with masculine heroism. This reversal of conventional dynamics created narrative tension that spoke to deeper questions about strength, vulnerability, and the nature of true partnership between equals who possessed different kinds of power. As both characters matured and society's expectations evolved, their relationship deepened beyond the simple rescue and romance formula into something more nuanced and psychologically complex. Steve's military expertise and understanding of geopolitical realities provided tactical knowledge that complemented Diana's strategic wisdom and moral clarity. His very mortality served as constant reminder of the stakes involved in their missions. While Diana could survive almost any physical threat, Steve's vulnerability made every battle personal and every victory precious. The romantic dimension of their connection, while undeniably central to both characters' emotional development, was enriched by mutual respect that went far beyond physical attraction or conventional compatibility. Steve's ability to see Diana as both goddess and woman, to honor her divine nature while treating her as an equal partner in their shared mission, provided emotional grounding that no amount of Amazon training could have prepared her to value. His unwavering loyalty in the face of dangers that would have broken lesser mortals demonstrated courage that matched her own, albeit expressed through different means and drawing upon different sources. Etta Candy emerged as another crucial relationship that shaped Diana's understanding of human friendship and female solidarity outside the rarefied atmosphere of Amazon sisterhood. Where Themyscira's immortal women possessed centuries of shared history and divine purpose, Etta represented the immediate, enthusiastic, utterly mortal friendship that could spring up between kindred spirits, regardless of their vastly different backgrounds and capabilities. Her ebullient personality and fierce loyalty provided emotional support that complemented Steve's romantic partnership, creating a network of human connections that kept Diana anchored to the world she served. Etta's evolution from comic relief to substantial character in her own right reflected growing recognition that Wonder Woman's supporting cast needed depth and agency beyond their relationships to the title character. Her career in military intelligence, her romantic relationships, her personal struggles with self-image and professional advancement all contributed to a fuller portrait of the modern women whose lives Diana's heroic example was meant to inspire and protect. Through Etta, Diana experienced vicarious participation in the ordinary concerns of mortal women: career pressures, family obligations, financial worries, health issues that her divine nature and Amazon upbringing had never required her to face directly. The friendship between Diana and Etta also provided opportunities to explore themes of class and privilege that might otherwise have been overlooked in stories focused on cosmic threats and mythological conflicts. Diana's status as literal princess, combined with her supernatural abilities and diplomatic immunity, insulated her from many of the systemic inequalities and daily frustrations that shaped Edda's experiences as a working woman in male-dominated professional environments. Their conversations often revealed how even the most well-intentioned heroic intervention could not address structural problems that required political and social change rather than individual action. Within the superhero community itself, Diana's relationships with her peers in the Justice League created a complex dynamic that balanced mutual respect, with inevitable tensions arising from different approaches to heroism and justice. Her connection with Superman represented perhaps the purest form of heroic kinship. Two individuals whose extraordinary power was matched by unwavering moral conviction, whose outsider status as immigrants to Earth was balanced by complete dedication to protecting their adopted home. Their friendship transcended romantic speculation to become something approaching mythological significance, the meeting of divine and alien perspectives on what it meant to serve humanity. The philosophical alignment between Superman and Wonder Woman often put them at odds with Batman's more pragmatic and cynical approach to crime fighting. Where Diana and Clark believed in the fundamental goodness of humanity and the possibility of redemption for even the most corrupt individuals, Bruce's experiences had taught him to trust in preparation, surveillance, and the necessity of sometimes choosing lesser evils to prevent greater catastrophes. These disagreements, while never destroying their mutual respect and cooperation, created productive tension that forced all three characters to examine and defend their core beliefs. Diana's unique position as the lone woman among the League's founding members created both opportunities and challenges that reflected broader issues of gender representation in heroic narratives. Her presence elevated discussions of justice beyond simple crime and punishment formulas to encompass questions of social equity, systemic oppression, and the responsibilities that came with privilege and power. Her Amazon heritage provided perspective on alternative social organizations that could challenge assumptions about inevitable hierarchies and competitive relationships. The rivalries that defined much of Wonder Woman's heroic career were distinguished by their psychological complexity and mythological significance. Unlike many superhero conflicts that stemmed from misunderstandings or competing interests, Diana's greatest enemies represented fundamental philosophical opposition to everything she embodied. These were not merely obstacles to overcome, but ideological challenges that tested her beliefs and forced her to articulate and defend the principles that guided her actions. Dr. Barbara Ann Minerva's transformation into the Cheetah created perhaps the most personal and tragic of these rivalries. As a respected archaeologist whose scholarly interests aligned with Diana's mythological origins, Barbara had initially been positioned as potential friend and intellectual equal. Her transformation into a savage predator, driven by supernatural bloodlust, represented the corruption of everything Diana valued, scholarship perverted into obsession, strength twisted into cruelty, intelligence poisoned by envy and hatred. The psychological dynamics of their conflict went far beyond simple hero versus villain confrontation to explore themes of privilege, transformation, and the seductive nature of power without responsibility. Barbara's resentment of Diana's inherited advantages, divine blessing, Amazon training, automatic acceptance as hero and symbol, reflected real-world tensions between those born to privilege and those who struggled to achieve recognition and respect through personal effort alone. Her willingness to sacrifice her humanity for supernatural power served as dark mirror to Diana's own journey from Amazon princess to global champion. Circe represented a different form of opposition, ancient wisdom corrupted by bitterness and the desire for revenge against injustices both real and imagined. As immortal sorceress whose magical abilities could match or exceed Diana's divine gifts, Circe posed threats that could not be resolved through simple application of superior force. Her schemes often forced Diana to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of power and the responsibilities that came with mythological significance. The philosophical dimension of their rivalry centered on different interpretations of what immortality and power should mean. Where Diana used her gifts in service of protection and justice, Circe's long life had taught her that mortal concerns were ultimately meaningless, that individual suffering was insignificant compared to cosmic patterns that played out across millennia. Her willingness to manipulate and sacrifice mortals in pursuit of her goals represented the corruption that Diana struggled to avoid in her own relationship with humanity. Dr. Psycho embodied perhaps the most disturbing form of opposition. Diana faced hatred directed specifically at her gender and everything it represented. His telepathic abilities allowed him to weaponize society's own prejudices and limitations, turning ambient sexism and misogyny into literal psychic attacks that could influence minds and distort perceptions. Battles with Dr. Psycho became struggles not just against individual villain, but against systemic oppression that infected human consciousness at levels too deep for conventional heroic intervention to address. The personal dimension of this rivalry was particularly challenging because Dr. Psycho's attacks targeted Diana's identity as woman rather than her role as hero. His schemes often forced her to defend not just her own actions but the fundamental validity of female strength and leadership in contexts where such concepts were still controversial or actively resisted. Victory against Dr. Psycho required not just defeating his immediate plans, but countering the broader cultural narratives that made his psychological manipulation possible. The relationship between Diana and Donna Troy added another layer of complexity to the network of connections that defined Wonder Woman's emotional landscape. As the first Wonder Girl, Donna represented both sister and protégé, creating bonds that combined familial affection with professional mentorship. Their connection transcended the typical hero-sidekick dynamic to explore questions of identity, destiny, and the burden of legacy that came with carrying on heroic traditions. Donna's own struggles with multiple origin stories and constantly shifting continuity provided metaphorical commentary on the challenges faced by female heroes in a medium that often seemed uncertain about how to portray strong women, without undermining or overshadowing their male counterparts. Her relationship with Diana became a laboratory for exploring different models of female heroism. How could strength be passed from one generation to the next without simply repeating established patterns? The mentorship dynamic between Diana and younger heroes like Cassie Sandsmark, the second Wonder Girl, reflected her evolution from student to teacher in the broader community of champions. These relationships required Diana to articulate the principles and values that had been instinctive during her own training, to find ways of communicating Amazon wisdom to individuals whose backgrounds and circumstances were vastly different from her own. Through Cassie, Diana experienced the challenges of guiding someone whose heroic calling emerged from very different circumstances than her own divine destiny. Where Diana had been literally crafted for heroism and trained from birth for her role as champion, Cassie's powers came through accident, and her training through trial and error. The contrast highlighted questions about whether heroism was primarily a matter of capability or character, whether divine blessing was necessary for true greatness, or simply one possible path among many. The complexity of these relationships, romantic, platonic, familial, professional, antagonistic, created a rich tapestry of human connection that grounded Diana's mythological significance in emotional reality. Through her interactions with others, she learned not just about humanity, but about herself, discovering aspects of her character that could only emerge through the challenges and opportunities that came from caring about others and being cared for in return. The diplomatic aspect of Diana's relationships extended beyond her personal connections to encompass her role as ambassador between worlds. Her work with the United Nations, with various governments, with international organizations, required skills that went far beyond traditional heroic capabilities. She had to learn to navigate political complexities that made battlefield strategy seem simple by comparison, to find common ground between parties whose fundamental assumptions about reality might be completely incompatible. These diplomatic relationships often proved more challenging than physical confrontations with supervillains. Evil could be opposed through application of superior force or moral authority, but political disagreement between well-intentioned parties required compromise, patience, and willingness to accept imperfect solutions to complex problems. Diana's Amazon training in justice and wisdom provided philosophical foundation for her diplomatic work, but the practical skills had to be learned through experience and occasional failure. The cultural impact of Diana's relationships extended far beyond the boundaries of comic book narratives to influence broader conversations about representation, diversity, and the possibility of different models for heroic character development. Her friendships with other women, her professional partnerships with male colleagues, her romantic relationship with Steve, her mentoring of younger heroes, all provided templates that could inspire real-world relationships while challenging conventional limitations on what such connections could achieve. As the network of relationships around Wonder Woman continued to evolve and expand, each new connection added depth to her character, while creating fresh opportunities for storytelling that balanced personal drama with cosmic significance. The Amazon princess who had emerged from isolation to serve the world had discovered that true strength came not from divine gifts alone, but from the bonds forged with others who shared her commitment to justice, truth, and the protection of all who needed champions. These relationships would sustain her through the trials yet to come, providing emotional anchors that kept her connected to humanity even as her responsibilities expanded to cosmic scope. They were the foundation upon which her legend was built, the proof that even gods needed friendship, love, and the complex web of human connection that made heroism meaningful rather than merely powerful. The summons came not through mortal channels of communication, but as divine imperative that resonated through every fiber of Diana's being, a cosmic call that transcended physical senses to speak directly to the part of her soul that remained forever connected to the Olympian realm. She felt it first as pressure building behind her eyes, then as harmonics that seemed to emanate from the very air around her. Finally, as irresistible compulsion that drew her consciousness away from earthly concerns toward obligations that predated her birth and would outlast her death. The gods were calling their champion home, not to rest, but to face trials that would test every aspect of her divine heritage and determine whether she was truly worthy of the cosmic responsibilities they had placed upon her shoulders. Mount Olympus, when she arrived through mystical transportation that collapsed the barriers between mortal and divine realms, appeared both exactly as she remembered from childhood visits and utterly transformed by the weight of impending judgment. The marble palaces still gleamed with inner light that came from divine essence rather than mere reflection, while gardens continued to bloom with flowers that sang hymns to beauty itself. Yet underneath this eternal splendor lay currents of tension that spoke to conflicts brewing in the highest circles of power, disagreements between immortal beings whose decisions could reshape reality itself. Zeus, seated upon his throne of crystallized lightning, while storm clouds gathered around his shoulders like a royal mantle, regarded his Amazon champion with eyes that held the weight of eons and the terrible burden of ultimate authority. "Daughter of clay, daughter of my realm," he intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very foundations of Olympus resonate in sympathy. "The time has come to determine whether the gifts we bestowed upon you have been worthy of the divine essence they contain. You have served well in the mortal realm, but service to humanity alone does not prove fitness for the greater responsibilities that await." The trials that followed would test Diana in ways that no earthly conflict had ever approached, challenging not just her physical capabilities or moral convictions, but the fundamental nature of her identity as bridge between divine and mortal realms. These were not mere contests of strength or skill, but examinations of character that probed the deepest levels of her being, searching for weaknesses that might compromise her effectiveness as cosmic guardian and representative of Olympic ideals. The first trial transported her to a realm where abstract concepts took on physical form, where the very ideas that shaped reality could be grasped, weighed, and manipulated like tangible objects. Here, in a landscape that defied every law of physics, while obeying higher principles of meaning and symbolism, Diana found herself confronting embodiments of justice, mercy, wisdom, and strength not as allies but as judges whose approval she would need to earn through demonstration rather than declaration. Justice appeared as a figure of terrible beauty, whose blindfolded visage spoke to impartiality that transcended personal sympathy or individual preference. Her scales, forged from metals that existed only in this realm of pure concept, weighed not actions but intentions, not outcomes, but the moral reasoning that had guided critical decisions. Diana found herself reliving every moment of moral choice from her heroic career, from the smallest acts of kindness to the largest strategic decisions that had affected thousands of lives. "Why do you spare your enemies?" Justice demanded, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic law. You possess power sufficient to eliminate threats permanently, yet you consistently choose methods that allow evil to return, to threaten innocence again and again. How do you justify this apparent contradiction between capability and action? Diana's response drew upon decades of Amazon training and lived experience that had taught her the difference between justice and vengeance, between necessary force and gratuitous violence. "Justice without mercy becomes tyranny," she replied, her voice steady despite the awesome nature of her interrogator. "The power to destroy carries with it the responsibility to preserve whenever possible. My enemies are often victims of circumstances beyond their control, madness, manipulation, corruption that clouds their judgment. To kill when healing might suffice would make me complicit in the very destruction I seek to prevent." The examination that followed probed every aspect of Diana's moral reasoning, from her treatment of unrepentant villains to her decisions about when violence was necessary and when other solutions might suffice. Justice weighed her words against her deeds, her stated principles against their practical application, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal hidden corruption or self-deception that could compromise her effectiveness as cosmic guardian. Mercy, appearing as a figure whose radiance seemed to ease pain simply through proximity, presented different challenges that tested Diana's capacity for forgiveness and understanding, even in the face of horrific evil. The trial transported her through scenarios where she witnessed suffering that cried out for vengeance, injustices so profound that mercy seemed not just inappropriate but morally offensive to victims who deserved better than compassionate platitudes. "Feel their pain," Mercy commanded, opening Diana's enhanced senses to the full emotional weight of every crime she had encountered, every victim she had failed to save, every consequence of her decisions to show restraint when destruction might have prevented future suffering. Know what your mercy costs. Understand the price others pay for your principles. Can you still claim compassion when your choices allow others to suffer? The psychological assault was more devastating than any physical torture Diana had ever endured. She experienced the terror of every civilian caught in crossfire, the despair of every family destroyed by villains she had chosen to capture rather than kill, the rage of every victim whose suffering could have been prevented by more decisive action. Yet through it all, she held to convictions that came not from naive idealism, but from hard-won wisdom about the nature of true strength. "Mercy is not weakness disguised as virtue," she declared, her voice carrying authority that came from divine heritage and mortal experience combined. "It is the strongest choice available, the decision to break cycles of violence rather than perpetuate them, to heal rather than harm when healing is possible. The pain I feel for those who suffer does not diminish my commitment to mercy, but strengthens it, because I understand the full cost of both action and inaction." Wisdom tested Diana's judgment and decision-making abilities through scenarios that had no clear right answers, situations where every choice carried significant moral weight and unintended consequences. These were not simple ethical dilemmas, with obvious solutions but complex problems that required balancing competing values, weighing imperfect options, making decisions with incomplete information, while accepting responsibility for outcomes that could not be fully predicted or controlled. The trial placed her in command of cosmic forces that could reshape reality itself, granting her temporary authority over natural laws and fundamental constants that governed existence. With such power came impossible choices: save one world by allowing another to suffer, prevent one catastrophe by enabling a different disaster, protect the innocent at the cost of compromising principles that had guided her entire heroic career. "Power without wisdom is chaos," the embodiment of wisdom observed, watching as Diana struggled with decisions that would have staggered even experienced gods. "But wisdom without power is merely philosophy. You have been granted gifts that few beings in any realm possess. How will you use them when the stakes exceed anything you have previously imagined?" The scenarios grew progressively more challenging, forcing Diana to confront limitations in her own understanding, while making decisions whose consequences would ripple across multiple dimensions and affect countless lives. She learned to accept imperfection in her choices, while maintaining commitment to principles that could guide her even when perfect solutions were impossible. The wisdom she demonstrated was not omniscience, but the humility to acknowledge uncertainty while acting decisively based on the best information available. Strength, the final embodiment, presented challenges that went far beyond physical power to encompass every form of fortitude, emotional resilience, moral courage, spiritual endurance, intellectual persistence. The trials transported Diana through experiences designed to break her will, to find the limits of her endurance and determination, to discover whether her strength was merely superhuman capability or something deeper that could sustain her through any conceivable trial. She faced the death of everyone she had ever loved, experienced failure on a cosmic scale that left entire civilizations in ruins, endured isolation that stretched across eons while maintaining hope for eventual redemption. Each trial was designed to find her breaking point, to locate the threshold beyond which even Amazon training and divine blessing could not sustain her commitment to heroic principles. Strength is tested not by what you can endure, but by what you can endure without becoming corrupted. Strength explained as Diana emerged from trials that had lasted subjective centuries while occupying only moments in the divine realm. Power that serves only itself becomes its own form of weakness. True strength is measured by service to something greater than personal survival or satisfaction. The final phase of the trials brought together all four embodiments in a test that challenged every aspect of Diana's character simultaneously. She found herself confronting the fundamental question that lay at the heart of cosmic responsibility. Was she prepared to make decisions that would affect not just the mortal realm, but the nature of existence itself? Could she balance the competing demands of justice, mercy, wisdom, and strength when they pointed in different directions? The scenario presented was deceptively simple, yet infinitely complex, a cosmic imbalance that threatened to destroy the barriers between order and chaos, requiring intervention from someone with both the power to act and the wisdom to choose correctly. Diana's decision would determine not just the fate of particular worlds, but the fundamental principles that would govern reality for eons to come. Her solution, when it emerged after consideration that spanned both instants and eternities, demonstrated the synthesis of all her training, experience, and divine heritage. Rather than choosing between competing values, she found ways to honor all of them simultaneously. Justice that included mercy, strength that served wisdom, decisions that balanced immediate needs with long-term consequences. Zeus, observing from his throne of judgment, nodded with approval that carried the weight of cosmic affirmation. You have proven yourself worthy not just of the gifts we bestowed, but of the greater responsibilities that await, he declared, his words resonating through every realm of existence. You are confirmed as champion of the gods, guardian of the cosmic balance, bridge between divine will and mortal need. The investiture that followed granted Diana authorities and capabilities that exceeded anything she had previously possessed, but with them came burdens that would test her for the remainder of her immortal existence. She became responsible not just for protecting humanity, but for maintaining the balance between order and chaos that kept existence itself stable and meaningful. As she returned to the mortal realm, carrying with her the cosmic authority she had earned through trial and proven worthy to wield, Diana understood that her mission had evolved beyond anything she could have imagined when she first left Themyscira's shores. She was no longer merely Wonder Woman, Amazon princess serving as hero and ambassador. She had become something unprecedented, a mortal who had been deemed worthy of cosmic responsibility, a bridge between human concerns and divine purpose, a champion whose service extended beyond any single world or realm. The trials were complete, the testing was finished, but the true work, balancing cosmic responsibility with human compassion, divine authority with mortal understanding, was just beginning. Diana had proven herself worthy of the gods' trust. Now, she would discover what that trust truly meant. The first tremors of catastrophe reached Themyscira not as physical vibrations through earth and sea, but as psychic disturbances that registered in the deepest consciousness of every Amazon on the island, a collective unease that spoke to threats approaching their paradise from directions they could not identify or comprehend. Diana felt it during her morning training session, a wrongness that made her lasso flicker with agitated energy and caused her bracelets to grow warm against her skin. as if the very artifacts that connected her to her people's destiny were trying to warn her of dangers that had not yet manifested in the physical realm. The oracle's visions, when they came, arrived fragmented and contradictory, painted in images that defied interpretation, while carrying emotional weight that left even the most experienced seers drained and shaken. Fire falling from clear skies, sisters turning against sisters, the purple shores of Paradise Island running red with Amazon blood, ancient walls crumbling beneath weapons that had never been forged, children crying for mothers who could no longer answer their calls. Each vision was worse than the last, yet none provided clear indication of what threat was approaching or how it might be countered. Queen Hippolyta, her immortal composure strained by prophecies that spoke to her deepest fears as both ruler and mother, convened the Council of Generals in emergency session, while mystical defenses that had protected Themyscira for millennia were strengthened and reinforced. The invisible barriers that kept their island hidden from mortal detection were doubled and tripled, while Amazon warriors took positions that had not been manned since the earliest days of their civilization, when threats from the outside world had been common rather than merely theoretical. Yet the attack, when it finally came, arrived from a direction that all their preparations had failed to anticipate. The enemy did not assault their mystical barriers or attempt to penetrate their physical defenses, but struck instead at the very foundations of Amazon society, the bonds of sisterhood that held their civilization together, the shared purpose that had sustained them through millennia of peace, the trust that made their communal existence possible. Alcyone, once among Hippolyta's most trusted captains, emerged as the leader of a faction that had been secretly festering for decades, fed by resentments that had been carefully hidden beneath surfaces of apparent loyalty and devotion. Her grievances, when they were finally voiced in the great amphitheater where Amazon law was debated and decided, struck at the heart of everything their society claimed to represent. "We have become complacent," she declared before an assembly that listened with growing horror to accusations that challenged their most fundamental assumptions about themselves and their purpose. "Hidden away in our paradise while the world burns, content to send one champion to fight battles that should engage our entire civilization. We are warriors who have forgotten how to wage war. Immortals who have grown afraid of the very conflicts that gave our existence meaning." The schism that followed tore through Amazon society like fire through dry grass, dividing families, breaking friendships, turning training partners into bitter enemies who could no longer bear to share the same training ground. Some rallied to Alcyone's banner, convinced that Themyscira had indeed become too isolated, too passive, too willing to rely on Diana's individual heroism rather than asserting their collective strength. Others remained loyal to Hippolyta's vision of Amazon purpose, arguing that their role was to preserve wisdom and serve as sanctuary rather than to impose their will upon the wider world through force. Diana, torn between her responsibilities to man's world and her loyalty to her people, found herself caught in the center of a conflict that had no clear resolution and no obvious villains. Alcyone's criticisms contained enough truth to be painful. The Amazons had become isolated, had perhaps grown too comfortable in their paradise, while others suffered in the wider world. Yet her solutions seemed to abandon everything that made Amazon civilization worth preserving, in favor of becoming just another conquering force motivated by self-righteousness and superior capabilities. The civil war that erupted across Themyscira's sacred grounds violated everything the island had been created to represent. Sister fought sister with weapons that had been crafted for protection rather than aggression, while buildings that had stood for millennia crumbled beneath the fury of immortal warriors whose disagreements could not be resolved through debate or compromise. The very air seemed to weep with the knowledge that paradise itself was being destroyed, not by external enemies, but by internal contradictions that had been allowed to fester in silence. Diana's attempts at mediation, drawing upon diplomatic skills that had served her well in international conflicts, proved inadequate to bridge philosophical differences that went to the core of Amazon identity and purpose. How could she reconcile visions of their future that were fundamentally incompatible? How could she heal wounds that had been inflicted by those who had once been closer than family? The warrior training that had prepared her for any external threat provided no guidance for conflicts that arose from the very virtues that Amazon civilization claimed to embody. The intervention of external forces transformed what had begun as philosophical disagreement into existential threat to Amazon's survival itself. Ares, recognizing an opportunity to strike at his ancient enemies while they were divided and weakened, began feeding weapons and tactical advice to the most radical elements on both sides of the conflict, ensuring that what might have remained a political dispute would escalate into warfare that could destroy Amazon's civilization entirely. Circe, the immortal sorceress, whose hatred of the Amazons stemmed from ancient grievances that predated written history, used her magical abilities to amplify the emotional intensity of the conflict, turning reasonable disagreements into irreconcilable rage that made compromise impossible and reconciliation unthinkable. Her spells worked not by creating hatred from nothing, but by magnifying feelings that already existed, taking normal frustrations and disappointments and transforming them into consuming fury that demanded satisfaction through violence. The arrival of mortal military forces, guided by intelligence that could only have come from Amazon traders working with outside agencies, represented the ultimate violation of Themyscira's sanctuary status. These were not random invaders, but carefully selected special forces units, equipped with weapons specifically designed to counter Amazon advantages, supplied with tactical information that revealed defensive positions and strategic vulnerabilities that should have been impossible for outsiders to know. The siege that followed tested every aspect of Amazon military capability, while forcing Diana to confront the possibility that the paradise she had been raised to protect might be doomed not by external conquest, but by internal collapse. That made external conquest possible. The mystical barriers that had hidden Themyscira from mortal detection for millennia began to fail under assault from weapons that combined advanced technology with mystical energies, while Amazon defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who knew their capabilities and had prepared countermeasures for their traditional advantages. Hippolyta's capture during a raid that penetrated to the very heart of the palace represented more than mere tactical victory. For the attackers, it was psychological warfare designed to break Amazon morale by removing the symbol of their unity and purpose. The queen who had guided their civilization for thousands of years, who embodied everything they aspired to achieve and defend, was dragged away in chains forged from metals that could contain even her immortal strength. Diana's desperate search for her mother led her through landscapes both physical and psychological that had been transformed by conflict beyond recognition. The peaceful valleys, where she had trained as a child, were now battlefields scarred by weapons that violated the very nature of their paradise, while the crystal springs that had provided healing for millennia ran foul with the psychic poison of hatred and betrayal. Every step of her journey revealed new evidence of how completely their world had been corrupted by forces they had believed themselves immune to experiencing. The revelation that some of her oldest friends and most trusted advisors had been working with enemy forces struck Diana with impact that exceeded any physical blow she had ever endured. These were not strangers or casual allies, but sisters who had shared her training, her dreams, her commitment to Amazon ideals, yet they had chosen to betray everything they claimed to hold sacred in pursuit of goals that remained unclear even after their treachery was exposed. "You never understood," one of them declared during a confrontation that took place among the ruins of the temple, where they had both sworn their first oaths of loyalty. "You were always special, always chosen, always destined for greatness, that the rest of us could never hope to achieve. We were tired of living in your shadow, tired of watching you receive honors and opportunities that were denied to equally worthy sisters simply because you were the queen's daughter." The psychological dimension of this betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, forcing Diana to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and resentment that she had never fully understood despite her diplomatic training and experience with human political dynamics. How many of her sisters harbored similar feelings? How much of Amazon unity had been illusion maintained through silence about inequalities and disappointments that festered beneath their surface harmony? The exile that followed, whether chosen voluntarily as penance for failing to prevent the catastrophe, or imposed by sisters who blamed her for bringing the attention that had led to their destruction, removed Diana from the only home she had ever known, while leaving her responsible for carrying on traditions that might no longer have anywhere to flourish. She became Amazon in exile, guardian of heritage that existed now only in her memory and commitment, keeper of wisdom that might die with her if she failed to find ways to pass it on to others. The invisible jet that carried her away from Themyscira's smoking ruins was more than mere transportation. It became a mobile embassy, a fragment of Amazon technology that represented the last tangible connection to a civilization that might be gone forever. As the mystical barriers that had protected her homeland for millennia finally collapsed entirely, allowing mortal satellites and reconnaissance aircraft to photograph what had once been hidden paradise, Diana understood that she was witnessing not just the end of a place, but the conclusion of an entire era of possibilities. The grief that consumed her during those first months of exile went beyond personal loss to encompass something approaching cosmic mourning, sorrow for dreams that would never be fulfilled, for wisdom that might never be shared, for examples of alternative ways of living that the world would never have the chance to learn from. The Amazons had represented proof that human societies could transcend the limitations that most people accepted as inevitable, that cooperation was possible on scales that exceeded family or tribe, that strength could serve wisdom rather than dominating it. The world that received reports of Themyscira's destruction reacted with mixture of fascination and indifference that revealed how little most people understood what had been lost. News media treated it as curiosity rather than tragedy, archaeological mystery rather than civilizational catastrophe, while governments quietly celebrated the elimination of a potential threat to their sovereignty that they had never fully understood but had always suspected might challenge their authority. Only among the community of heroes did Diana find understanding of the magnitude of what had been lost and the weight of responsibility she now carried as the sole survivor of a civilization that had lasted longer than most historical periods. Superman's attempt at comfort, drawing upon his own experience as the last son of a doomed world, provided some solace, but could not fully address the unique aspects of Diana's situation he had never known. Krypton personally, while she carried living memories of paradise and the burden of wondering whether she could have prevented its destruction. The investigation that followed, as Diana attempted to piece together exactly how and why Themyscira had fallen, revealed a web of conspiracies and manipulations that extended across multiple realms and involved players she had never suspected of harboring hostility toward her people. Government agencies that had benefited from Amazon cooperation while secretly working to eliminate what they viewed as anomalous threats to global stability, mystical entities that had been corrupted by exposure to powers they could not comprehend, business interests that saw profit in exploiting Amazon resources and technologies, the search for surviving sisters, scattered across the globe by the chaos of Themyscira's final days, became a quest that combined detective work with archaeology, as Diana followed clues that led through both ancient historical sites and contemporary locations where Amazon refugees might have sought sanctuary. Each reunion was bittersweet joy at discovering that someone had survived, tempered by sorrow at learning how much had been lost, how many gaps existed in their collective memory and cultural knowledge. The slow work of rebuilding, whether physical reconstruction of a new sanctuary or cultural preservation through teaching and example, required Diana to become something she had never trained to be, not just warrior or diplomat, but educator, librarian, keeper of traditions that existed now only in the memories of scattered survivors. The Amazon way of life would have to be adapted to new circumstances, preserved through new methods, transmitted to new generations, who might never see the paradise where it had originally flourished. As Diana stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean, watching waves that might have once lapped against Themyscira's purple shores, she understood that Paradise Lost was not merely an ending, but a transformation, a challenge to prove that Amazon ideals could survive even the destruction of the society that had originally nurtured them. The work ahead would be harder than any battle she had ever fought, requiring her to rebuild not just places but possibilities, not just communities but dreams of what communities could become. The title of Wonder Woman, which had once connected her to a proud tradition stretching back millennia, now carried new weight as she became the living embodiment of everything that tradition had meant and might yet mean again. She was no longer Princess of Paradise, but Guardian of Paradise's promise, keeper of the faith that wisdom and compassion could still triumph over force and fear, even in a world that seemed determined to prove such hopes naive. The Paradise Lost was also Paradise Remembered, carried forward in the heart of one who had loved it enough to preserve its essence, even after its physical form had been destroyed. Through her, the Amazon way would endure, evolve, and perhaps someday flourish again, not in hidden isolation, but as an example visible to all who sought better ways of living together on a troubled planet that desperately needed the wisdom that Themyscira had spent millennia perfecting. The cosmic upheaval known as Flashpoint tore through the fabric of reality like a hurricane through tissue paper, reshaping not merely the timeline but the fundamental nature of existence itself. When Barry Allen, the Flash, attempted to save his mother's life by traveling back through time to prevent her murder, he unknowingly triggered a cascade of changes that would remake the entire multiverse, according to principles that owed more to chaos theory than to the orderly progression of cause and effect that had previously governed cosmic events. Wonder Woman, along with every other hero and villain whose existence depended upon the delicate balance of established continuity, found herself caught in transformations that would test the very core of her identity. The world that emerged from this temporal catastrophe bore only superficial resemblance to the reality Diana had known and served for decades. In this new timeline, the Amazons of Themyscira were not peaceful guardians of ancient wisdom, but active participants in a global conflict that had consumed entire continents, their warrior culture unleashed upon a world that trembled before their supernatural might. The paradise that had once served as sanctuary for those seeking justice had become a military power whose territorial ambitions matched those of any historical empire. While the ideals of compassion and wisdom that had guided Amazon civilization for millennia seemed to have been abandoned in favor of more pragmatic considerations of conquest and dominance, Diana herself, in this altered reality, stood not as bridge between worlds but as one of the primary architects of global warfare. Her relationship with Steve Trevor had never bloomed into the love affair that had humanized her connection to mortal concerns. Instead, a romance with Arthur Curry, the king of Atlantis, who had become her partner in reshaping the geopolitical landscape, had led to conflicts that dwarfed anything the original timeline had ever experienced. The wedding of Amazon and Atlantean royalty had been designed as political alliance, but when betrayal shattered their union, the resulting war between land and sea had claimed millions of lives, while reducing vast regions of the Earth to apocalyptic battlefields. The character who bore Diana's name and appearance in this Flashpoint reality retained her supernatural abilities and divine heritage, but the moral foundation that had defined Wonder Woman for decades had been replaced by pragmatic ruthlessness that would have horrified her original incarnation. This Diana led Amazon forces in campaigns that showed no mercy to civilian populations, employed weapons of mass destruction without apparent concern for collateral damage, and pursued military objectives with single-minded determination that acknowledged no higher authority than victory itself. The psychological impact of experiencing this alternative version of herself proved more devastating than any physical attack Diana had ever endured. To see her own face associated with atrocities that violated everything she held sacred, to witness her Amazon sisters participating in wholesale slaughter while invoking the same gods who had blessed her own mission of peace and protection, forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism and the fragility of the moral convictions that shaped her identity. How much of her heroic nature stemmed from circumstances rather than character? If minor changes in history could produce such radically different outcomes, what did that say about the stability of her own moral foundation? The Diana of the Flashpoint timeline was recognizably herself in terms of capabilities and background, yet utterly alien in terms of values and actions. The implication was deeply unsettling that heroism itself might be more contingent upon external factors than she had ever imagined. The restoration of proper reality, achieved through Barry Allen's sacrifice and the combined efforts of heroes from multiple timelines, did not simply return things to their previous state, but created what would become known as the New 52 universe, a reality that blended elements from various timelines, while introducing changes that would fundamentally alter established relationships and character dynamics. Wonder Woman emerged from this cosmic reconstruction with her essential nature intact, but her history significantly modified in ways that would influence every aspect of her future development. The most significant change involved the revelation of her true parentage, not the clay-born miracle child of earlier continuity, but the daughter of Zeus himself, conceived through divine union with Queen Hippolyta, in circumstances that had been hidden from Diana throughout her childhood and training. This revelation transformed her from Amazon princess blessed by the gods into something approaching Olympian royalty, with all the powers and responsibilities that divine heritage entailed. The psychological impact of learning that her entire understanding of her own origins had been based on carefully constructed deception created an identity crisis that went far beyond typical adolescent confusion about family relationships. Diana had built her sense of self around the story of her creation from clay and divine blessing, a narrative that emphasized love and intention over mere biological accident. To discover that she was instead the product of sexual union between her mother and the king of the gods forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about her nature and purpose. The political implications within Amazon society proved equally complex and troubling. If Diana was indeed Zeus's daughter, what did that mean for the careful balance of power that had maintained Themyscira's independence from direct divine interference? How could the other Amazons relate to someone whose divine heritage placed her in a category fundamentally different from their own? The revelation threatened to destroy the sisterhood that had been central to Amazon civilization, replacing bonds of chosen affection with hierarchies based on divine bloodlines. Hippolyta's role in maintaining this deception added layers of betrayal and disappointment that complicated Diana's relationship with the woman who had shaped her understanding of truth and justice. The queen who had preached the importance of honesty in all dealings had built her daughter's entire identity around a lie designed to protect her from knowledge that might have proved dangerous or destabilizing. The contradiction between Amazon ideals and Amazon practice created philosophical problems that could not be resolved through simple forgiveness or understanding. The pantheon of gods that Diana encountered in this new reality proved significantly more active and interventionist than their previous incarnations, treating the mortal realm as extension of their own domains rather than separate sphere deserving of respectful distance. Zeus's siblings and children viewed Diana not as honored ally, but as family member whose actions reflected upon their collective reputation, while their various schemes and conflicts drew her into divine politics that had little connection to her heroic mission on Earth. Apollo, positioned as regent of Olympus during Zeus's temporary absence, embodied the worst aspects of divine arrogance and entitlement that made him fundamentally unsuited for leadership responsibilities that required wisdom and restraint. His attempts to control Diana's actions and limit her independence created conflicts that forced her to choose between family loyalty and heroic principle, between divine obligation and mortal commitment. The firstborn, revealed as Diana's half-brother, whose prophesied destiny involved overthrowing Zeus and claiming dominion over both divine and mortal realms, represented the dark side of divine heritage that had been largely absent from previous continuity. His existence forced Diana to confront the possibility that her own divine nature might carry within it seeds of corruption or ambition that could transform her from protector into conqueror, from champion into tyrant. Wonder Woman's role within the Justice League during this period reflected the broader changes that had altered the dynamics of heroic cooperation in the New 52 universe. The team that formed in response to Darkseid's initial invasion of Earth brought together individuals who were more isolated and suspicious than their previous incarnations, creating friction that made effective cooperation difficult to achieve and maintain. Diana's relationship with Superman evolved beyond mere colleague status into romantic involvement that challenged both characters' previous emotional commitments while creating new opportunities for storytelling that explored themes of power, responsibility, and the challenges of maintaining human connections when one possessed capabilities that exceeded mortal comprehension. Their partnership represented something unprecedented in superhero literature, the union of two beings whose individual strength was matched by shared commitment to protecting a world that could never fully understand or appreciate their sacrifices. The romantic relationship with Superman, while providing emotional depth and narrative possibilities that had been largely absent from Diana's previous characterization, also sparked controversy among fans who felt that it diminished her independence and reduced her to mere love interest for the more famous male character. The criticism reflected broader concerns about representation and agency in superhero narratives, highlighting the difficulty of creating meaningful romantic relationships for female characters without triggering accusations of stereotypical treatment. Batman's reaction to Diana's more aggressive approach to heroism created tension that reflected fundamental philosophical differences about the appropriate use of power and the responsibilities that came with superhuman capabilities. Where Bruce's experiences had taught him to value restraint and careful consideration of consequences, Diana's warrior training and divine heritage made her more willing to use decisive force when she believed it was justified by circumstances. The villains that emerged during this period reflected the darker, more violent tone that characterized much of the New 52 continuity. The Cheetah's transformation became more explicitly supernatural and irreversible, while new enemies like the Firstborn brought cosmic threats that required Diana to embrace aspects of her divine nature that she had previously kept carefully controlled. The stakes of conflict escalated beyond typical superhero parameters to encompass threats to reality itself. Ares, reimagined as a more complex figure, whose opposition to the Amazons stemmed from legitimate philosophical differences rather than simple malice, became something approaching mentor and ally whose lessons about the nature of conflict proved valuable, even when his methods remained questionable. The relationship between War God and Amazon Champion evolved beyond simple antagonism into complicated family dynamic that reflected the broader theme of Diana's struggle to understand her place within divine hierarchies. The art and visual presentation during this era emphasized the mythological aspects of Wonder Woman's adventures while incorporating design elements that reflected contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. Her costume received modifications that balanced classical inspiration with modern functionality, while the depiction of divine realms and mystical conflicts employed visual techniques that made supernatural elements feel visceral and immediate rather than abstractly fantastical. Critics of the New 52 Wonder Woman argued that the emphasis on divine politics and mythological conflicts had moved the character too far from her roots as champion of justice and peace, while supporters contended that the increased focus on her unique background and capabilities had finally given her adventures the epic scope they deserved. The debate reflected broader questions about the balance between innovation and tradition in long-running characters whose legacy spanned multiple generations of readers. The commercial and critical reception of this era demonstrated both the potential and the challenges inherent in major character reinvention. Sales figures remained strong while critical acclaim was mixed, with some reviewers praising the mythological depth and visual spectacle, while others mourned the loss of elements that had defined the character for decades. The response highlighted the difficulty of satisfying both longtime fans attached to established interpretations and new readers seeking fresh approaches to familiar concepts. As the New 52 era progressed, and Diana's characterization evolved through various creative teams and storylines, the lessons learned from this period of radical reinvention would continue to influence her portrayal long after the specific continuity changes had been modified or reversed. The experience had demonstrated both her resilience as character concept and the importance of maintaining core elements that defined her essential nature while allowing for growth and adaptation that could keep her relevant to changing audiences and cultural contexts. The Odyssey that had begun with Flashpoint and continued through the New 52 represented more than mere editorial mandate or creative experimentation. It was a journey of discovery that revealed new possibilities for character development while testing the boundaries of how much change established heroes could absorb while retaining their fundamental identity. Wonder Woman had survived the transformation, but she had also been transformed by surviving it, emerging with deeper understanding of her own nature and broader appreciation for the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that would guide her adventures in whatever realities might follow. The cosmic upheaval known as Flashpoint tore through the fabric of reality like a hurricane through tissue paper, reshaping not merely the timeline but the fundamental nature of existence itself. When Barry Allen, the Flash, attempted to save his mother's life by traveling back through time to prevent her murder, he unknowingly triggered a cascade of changes that would remake the entire multiverse, according to principles that owed more to chaos theory than to the orderly progression of cause and effect that had previously governed cosmic events. Wonder Woman, along with every other hero and villain whose existence depended upon the delicate balance of established continuity, found herself caught in transformations that would test the very core of her identity. The world that emerged from this temporal catastrophe bore only superficial resemblance to the reality Diana had known and served for decades. In this new timeline, the Amazons of Themyscira were not peaceful guardians of ancient wisdom, but active participants in a global conflict that had consumed entire continents, their warrior culture unleashed upon a world that trembled before their supernatural might. The paradise that had once served as sanctuary for those seeking justice had become a military power whose territorial ambitions matched those of any historical empire. While the ideals of compassion and wisdom that had guided Amazon civilization for millennia seemed to have been abandoned in favor of more pragmatic considerations of conquest and dominance, Diana herself, in this altered reality, stood not as bridge between worlds but as one of the primary architects of global warfare. Her relationship with Steve Trevor had never bloomed into the love affair that had humanized her connection to mortal concerns. Instead, a romance with Arthur Curry, the king of Atlantis, who had become her partner in reshaping the geopolitical landscape, had led to conflicts that dwarfed anything the original timeline had ever experienced. The wedding of Amazon and Atlantean royalty had been designed as political alliance, but when betrayal shattered their union, the resulting war between land and sea had claimed millions of lives, while reducing vast regions of the Earth to apocalyptic battlefields. The character who bore Diana's name and appearance in this Flashpoint reality retained her supernatural abilities and divine heritage, but the moral foundation that had defined Wonder Woman for decades had been replaced by pragmatic ruthlessness that would have horrified her original incarnation. This Diana led Amazon forces in campaigns that showed no mercy to civilian populations, employed weapons of mass destruction without apparent concern for collateral damage, and pursued military objectives with single-minded determination that acknowledged no higher authority than victory itself. The psychological impact of experiencing this alternative version of herself proved more devastating than any physical attack Diana had ever endured. To see her own face associated with atrocities that violated everything she held sacred, to witness her Amazon sisters participating in wholesale slaughter while invoking the same gods who had blessed her own mission of peace and protection, forced her to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism and the fragility of the moral convictions that shaped her identity. How much of her heroic nature stemmed from circumstances rather than character? If minor changes in history could produce such radically different outcomes, what did that say about the stability of her own moral foundation? The Diana of the Flashpoint timeline was recognizably herself in terms of capabilities and background, yet utterly alien in terms of values and actions. The implication was deeply unsettling that heroism itself might be more contingent upon external factors than she had ever imagined. The restoration of proper reality, achieved through Barry Allen's sacrifice and the combined efforts of heroes from multiple timelines, did not simply return things to their previous state, but created what would become known as the New 52 universe, a reality that blended elements from various timelines, while introducing changes that would fundamentally alter established relationships and character dynamics. Wonder Woman emerged from this cosmic reconstruction with her essential nature intact, but her history significantly modified in ways that would influence every aspect of her future development. The most significant change involved the revelation of her true parentage, not the clay-born miracle child of earlier continuity, but the daughter of Zeus himself, conceived through divine union with Queen Hippolyta, in circumstances that had been hidden from Diana throughout her childhood and training. This revelation transformed her from Amazon princess blessed by the gods into something approaching Olympian royalty, with all the powers and responsibilities that divine heritage entailed. The psychological impact of learning that her entire understanding of her own origins had been based on carefully constructed deception created an identity crisis that went far beyond typical adolescent confusion about family relationships. Diana had built her sense of self around the story of her creation from clay and divine blessing, a narrative that emphasized love and intention over mere biological accident. To discover that she was instead the product of sexual union between her mother and the king of the gods forced her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about her nature and purpose. The political implications within Amazon society proved equally complex and troubling. If Diana was indeed Zeus's daughter, what did that mean for the careful balance of power that had maintained Themyscira's independence from direct divine interference? How could the other Amazons relate to someone whose divine heritage placed her in a category fundamentally different from their own? The revelation threatened to destroy the sisterhood that had been central to Amazon civilization, replacing bonds of chosen affection with hierarchies based on divine bloodlines. Hippolyta's role in maintaining this deception added layers of betrayal and disappointment that complicated Diana's relationship with the woman who had shaped her understanding of truth and justice. The queen who had preached the importance of honesty in all dealings had built her daughter's entire identity around a lie designed to protect her from knowledge that might have proved dangerous or destabilizing. The contradiction between Amazon ideals and Amazon practice created philosophical problems that could not be resolved through simple forgiveness or understanding. The pantheon of gods that Diana encountered in this new reality proved significantly more active and interventionist than their previous incarnations, treating the mortal realm as extension of their own domains rather than separate sphere deserving of respectful distance. Zeus's siblings and children viewed Diana not as honored ally, but as family member whose actions reflected upon their collective reputation, while their various schemes and conflicts drew her into divine politics that had little connection to her heroic mission on Earth. Apollo, positioned as regent of Olympus during Zeus's temporary absence, embodied the worst aspects of divine arrogance and entitlement that made him fundamentally unsuited for leadership responsibilities that required wisdom and restraint. His attempts to control Diana's actions and limit her independence created conflicts that forced her to choose between family loyalty and heroic principle, between divine obligation and mortal commitment. The firstborn, revealed as Diana's half-brother, whose prophesied destiny involved overthrowing Zeus and claiming dominion over both divine and mortal realms, represented the dark side of divine heritage that had been largely absent from previous continuity. His existence forced Diana to confront the possibility that her own divine nature might carry within it seeds of corruption or ambition that could transform her from protector into conqueror, from champion into tyrant. Wonder Woman's role within the Justice League during this period reflected the broader changes that had altered the dynamics of heroic cooperation in the New 52 universe. The team that formed in response to Darkseid's initial invasion of Earth brought together individuals who were more isolated and suspicious than their previous incarnations, creating friction that made effective cooperation difficult to achieve and maintain. Diana's relationship with Superman evolved beyond mere colleague status into romantic involvement that challenged both characters' previous emotional commitments while creating new opportunities for storytelling that explored themes of power, responsibility, and the challenges of maintaining human connections when one possessed capabilities that exceeded mortal comprehension. Their partnership represented something unprecedented in superhero literature, the union of two beings whose individual strength was matched by shared commitment to protecting a world that could never fully understand or appreciate their sacrifices. The romantic relationship with Superman, while providing emotional depth and narrative possibilities that had been largely absent from Diana's previous characterization, also sparked controversy among fans who felt that it diminished her independence and reduced her to mere love interest for the more famous male character. The criticism reflected broader concerns about representation and agency in superhero narratives, highlighting the difficulty of creating meaningful romantic relationships for female characters without triggering accusations of stereotypical treatment. Batman's reaction to Diana's more aggressive approach to heroism created tension that reflected fundamental philosophical differences about the appropriate use of power and the responsibilities that came with superhuman capabilities. Where Bruce's experiences had taught him to value restraint and careful consideration of consequences, Diana's warrior training and divine heritage made her more willing to use decisive force when she believed it was justified by circumstances. The villains that emerged during this period reflected the darker, more violent tone that characterized much of the New 52 continuity. The cheetah's transformation became more explicitly supernatural and irreversible, while new enemies like the Firstborn brought cosmic threats that required Diana to embrace aspects of her divine nature that she had previously kept carefully controlled. The stakes of conflict escalated beyond typical superhero parameters to encompass threats to reality itself. Ares, reimagined as a more complex figure, whose opposition to the Amazons stemmed from legitimate philosophical differences rather than simple malice, became something approaching mentor and ally whose lessons about the nature of conflict proved valuable, even when his methods remained questionable. The relationship between War God and Amazon Champion evolved beyond simple antagonism into complicated family dynamic that reflected the broader theme of Diana's struggle to understand her place within divine hierarchies. The art and visual presentation during this era emphasized the mythological aspects of Wonder Woman's adventures while incorporating design elements that reflected contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. Her costume received modifications that balanced classical inspiration with modern functionality, while the depiction of divine realms and mystical conflicts employed visual techniques that made supernatural elements feel visceral and immediate rather than abstractly fantastical. Critics of the New 52 Wonder Woman argued that the emphasis on divine politics and mythological conflicts had moved the character too far from her roots as champion of justice and peace, while supporters contended that the increased focus on her unique background and capabilities had finally given her adventures the epic scope they deserved. The debate reflected broader questions about the balance between innovation and tradition in long-running characters whose legacy spanned multiple generations of readers. The commercial and critical reception of this era demonstrated both the potential and the challenges inherent in major character reinvention. Sales figures remained strong while critical acclaim was mixed, with some reviewers praising the mythological depth and visual spectacle, while others mourned the loss of elements that had defined the character for decades. The response highlighted the difficulty of satisfying both longtime fans attached to established interpretations and new readers seeking fresh approaches to familiar concepts. As the New 52 era progressed, and Diana's characterization evolved through various creative teams and storylines, the lessons learned from this period of radical reinvention would continue to influence her portrayal long after the specific continuity changes had been modified or reversed. The experience had demonstrated both her resilience as character concept and the importance of maintaining core elements that defined her essential nature while allowing for growth and adaptation that could keep her relevant to changing audiences and cultural contexts. The Odyssey that had begun with Flashpoint and continued through the New 52 represented more than mere editorial mandate or creative experimentation. It was a journey of discovery that revealed new possibilities for character development while testing the boundaries of how much change established heroes could absorb while retaining their fundamental identity. Wonder Woman had survived the transformation, but she had also been transformed by surviving it, emerging with deeper understanding of her own nature and broader appreciation for the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that would guide her adventures in whatever realities might follow.